Hey Barry,
Hey, Sam.
I'm gonna make you co-host
Okay. I'll watch for newbies.
since this is a even numbered Saturday of the month,
Oh, okay.
and we'll see whether it was Alex or whether it was Glenn that was gonna go today.
Gee, I don't remember anyone reserving it.
Yeah, it was one of those two.
Okay.
And I've only had like 3.5 hours sleep, so I'm not
Oh,
gonna make
really?
much sense today.
Okay. Yeah, David was a little bit, what's the word? A little loopy, I guess, a couple of days ago. I think same reason.
He's been sending around quite a whole series of posts.
Yeah, when he was diagnosed with HIV, that's Glenn, um, they they gave him a prescription for a cocktail, an antiviral cocktail, and he declined not to take it and instead opted for some magic mushroom, you know, stuff, which I think may be why he was a little weird. Some herbal, some quote
Yep,
magic mushroom herbal remedy
yep.
that's not what you're supposed to be taking for that.
Anyway, Glenn, welcome. Do you
Hey,
recall whether it's you or whether it's Alex who's taking this particular Saturday?
I think it was me according to the plan.
Right, good. I am making
Yeah,
you host then. And I only had, as I just explained to Barry, about 3.5 hours sleep today. So I'm likely to be incoherent at times. So I'm going to recede into the wallpaper for most of the session. And you are now host.
great.
And I'll make random,
Um,
incoherent comments from now and then.
I can just mention for you guys what I planned because I wanted to do co-visioning session
Yeah, good.
and to dream into some of the better futures and try to sketch out a couple of ingredients in the futures we would want or that would consider most interesting. And so I had this idea of the year 2050. And if we presume that by that year, there's a very big cultural transformation that's happened, a kind of an enlightenment, an evolution, we can say, renaissance, and then to try to imagine sort of the different parts of what life is like in that year and maybe in some of the years leading up to it. For example, what kind of events took place in this development where humanity came to this enlightenment, this unity, and really figure out a dynamic globally, which was very beneficial and very synergistic and healthy and sane and good. It's basically the theme that I would love to go into. And then, so that's the basic theme. And then I had a couple of ideas for just have a little structure in it to have a couple of main topics that we might want to take one by one. So I was thinking about what are some of the key pillars of the culture. And there's obviously things like the economy. There's also science and the knowledge production. and art, human, computer interactions. Hello,
Yep.
Kayla.
Yeah.
And several other things. So I thought maybe kind of go through that list, and then we'll just collect ideas, basically. So yeah, that was basically just my thoughts. I just wanted to run it by you guys first, if you think that sounds like a good plan, or if there's anything like you would add to it, or if I'm sort of, it's a little open-ended as well.
I like it. In fact, I've occasionally been doing that sort of thing. My questions are around those kind of questions as well. It's a different take on it, which is why I like letting different people have their own take on it. So yeah, I think CoVisioning is one of the pillars. Yeah, I love spending time on that.
Great. Yeah. So I don't know if we should wait a few minutes before I sort of introduce it, or.
There be Herr Heiner and also Kayla.
Yeah, they are with us. So good to see you, Heiner and Kayla.
Heiner, Kayla, today be Glenn Day. Glenn will lead us in CoVisioning, but he will introduce it formally, and I will be a passive participant.
Very nice.
Yeah, and I think it's fun to look into these subjects and see what we come up with. It's I also had in mind maybe we would want to use the chat if we wish. If anyone wants, they can write down what others say, but also, I mean, it's possible to write in specific visions into the chat. So yeah, but maybe I should wait maybe a few minutes before we begin, or should we just jump
Well, question
into it?
also whether you would like people to do a check-in.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could do a little optional check-in rounds, for example.
Well, happy to see you all. I haven't been around for a while, was busy and on other missions. I will only stay about 45 minutes, but I'm very happy to see common faces and co-vision and co-creation. I think it's very much hype. So I'm eager to learn what Glenn means by co-visioning.
Great. And Tyra, welcome.
Oh, Tyler's all dialed up today.
Yeah, looking great.
Tara, how be you? Welcome.
We're having a little optional round of check-ins before going into something.
Okay. Has everybody checked in?
No one has yet.
Heiner checked in a little bit.
Heiner, your
I can
lighting
check
is,
in.
sorry. Yeah. Hey,
Finish. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kayla.
I was just saying, Heiner, your face is unusually lit today. Are you in a exposed location?
Should I dim a little bit?
Well, we can see your face better if the lighting were not so strong right on your face. Let's see.
Well, I can move the light wherever you want to direct me to.
It's
I
just
thought
that
you've been
small.
to Amazon.
And actually, I want to eat and listen.
It's
Yeah, I
all
think
about the
Kayla.
lighting, Heiner.
Yeah.
All about the lighting.
Yeah.
I think Kayla, you wanted to check in.
Yeah,
nice,
I
very
just
nice.
finished another hike in a different
Wow.
location this time. Yeah, my
not even
goal
any
is
fun.
to just, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
because of my dog, there's absolutely no way I can sleep in. So I just kind of work with it, and I get to experience these beautiful sunrises in the hills of Ventura. So this hiking spot's really pretty and it's relatively flat. So I think tomorrow morning, if my mom wakes up in time, I'll take her there because I think this would be good for her. But I wanted to tell you all that one of the major families here in Ventura for Polynesian dance, you know, the last entertainer to kind of be involved in the family has moved to Las Vegas. So there is no one teaching here at all in Ventura County whatsoever. One of the major lay makers too, she's really good, strange lady, but she's really good. She moved to Texas. So there's none of that going on. So I contacted a couple of my people here in Ventura and said, hey, would you like to collaborate with me? Just because now I'm getting inquiries, people are asking, when are you going to ever teach again? When are you going to teach again? Lay season's coming up. So I'm kind of at a point where I really have to think about this because it's a lot of work. You know, it sounds dreamy and wonderful, and just because I'm skilled at dancing doesn't mean I'm skilled at marketing. You know, just because I'm skilled at choreography doesn't mean I'm skilled at, business overall. And I definitely need help as a single mother. Everyone knows that. Like, you can do it. I can do it, but I am not shy to say I still need help. So I did reach out to a lady who has an actual studio and who's looking for people to fill the slots. So we're talking today and I'm just letting it all percolate. And with that, I am complete.
Sounds like you're having a lot of opportunities, Kayla.
Kayla can start a business or get a job every 2 days if she wants.
She could be the president.
Yeah.
No.
Mayor of Ventura, Kayla.
Right.
I'm too progressive for these people.
It's the dance of life, presenting lots of opportunities.
I could give you a gift certificate for a rifle, Kayla.
No,
Hey.
I'm very blessed. Very blessed.
Let's talk later, but I'm not over promising, I hope, but help you, and I stress help, put up stuff like a website of your own if you like.
Oh yeah, because my website sucks. I also am looking for, I have to hire a marketing person. I've got these wonderful pictures and I'm a freak about them. And yes, I've competed and toured, but I'm still really insecure about my own pictures. And I feel like if I hire somebody to do it, then it's on them. And I'll be like, yeah, okay, this is your expertise. But if you ask me, I'll be like, no, don't take any pictures of me. So I think that's what I'm going to do, is hire somebody, because my marketing is ineffective because I'm a freak. So there.
Hey,
but yes,
Kayla,
thank you.
Kayla, if you want to come to my house, I have a studio where my sister-in-law, who's a model, does all of her photography, and she also brings other models over, and it's they've got the lighting, they've got the backdrop, the whole thing. If you ever want to come and just do a few for free, she's really good at it.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll talk
she's
to you
really
too.
good. She's really good with all of that. So if you want to just do some digital pictures, easy peasy, just to have a few to, update your site.
Yes.
And I could be
Today,
wrong, but isn't SEO one of Josh's specialties?
yeah, I think you're
Yeah,
right.
he knows a lot about that stuff.
And here he is.
He's very good at it.
Yay, Josh. Well, today is about Glenn, and I think I'll talk to everybody else later on my own time. But thank you. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Anyone else want to check in? You want to check in, talk, Barry, or
I'm here.
Go ahead. You're here. Yeah, we're here. We're here as usual. Nothing much to report.
sure? Okay, we can go into it. Did you want to say something, Sam? Go for it.
I'll just do like a 30-second check-in. As I mentioned to a few people, I only had like 3.5 hours sleep last night. So I'm glad that Glenn is hosting and moderating today. Just briefly though, had another really nice chat with my boss, the CEO, yesterday. And this project I've been on for about 2-3 months now, he's positive towards it. And so even yesterday, he was talking about expanding the team and, hiring about 2 or 3 really senior staff. So that's a cool indication of movement in a positive direction. So just thought I'd share that before I recede into the woodwork. The other thing is I'm close to the end of my option term for buying the house that I'm renting right now. So I'm scrambling like heck to try and arrange financing, which unfortunately is going to be difficult because I'm still suffering from my divorce. But on that front, it looks like my ex-wife and I are still trying to get it done by the end of this month. So that might actually be good. And so I'm just letting people know I'll be kind of distracted by matters of trying to buy this place. So I may be spending less time, at least for the next 2 months or so, while I'm trying to stay where I am rather than getting kicked out. So it'll be exciting no matter what happens. Anyway, I will now recede into the woodwork. Thank you.
That's not trivial. That's pretty serious business. Not knowing if you're going to be staying where you're staying, where you want to stay. That's pretty. With the dogs and everything, like, where would you go otherwise, Sam? Don't mind me asking.
Well, the cool thing is I have a pretty decent income, but I don't have a lot of assets because of the divorce, and I have horrible credit. So that's the challenge right there. So I'll have to get some people who are into creative financing because I could handle pretty decent, larger than normal monthly. I just don't have the piles and piles of cash just to put down, and very few loan sources are going to look at me because of my credit. So that's the issue. But on the other hand, if I was going to rent, there are plenty of places, there are houses here on acres of property. And because of what I'm paying for rent right now, I could actually swing that. But I'd love to stay where I am. That's the only issue. So thanks for asking.
No, that's it's definitely positive. It's good. It's good to have options. You and Kayla have lots of good problems.
Looks so idyllic out there.
By the way, since you said that, I just have to share something from my Facebook stream. Did you know it's about relationships? And some of you probably already saw this. The saying goes, relationships are about solving problems together, ... Problems you wouldn't have if you were single. Anyway, sorry. That just amuses me. I'll be silent now. Thank you.
Yeah, context is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great that you mentioned relationships, because that has to be a category today. Cool. Okay. Anyone else want to check in before we jump into it? Colin or Jimmy G?
Please proceed. Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, so the idea I had in mind was to try to do a co-visioning session where we imagine into the future the next 30 years. So I'm sort of just taking that a little bit at random. But the idea is that we just imagine that the future scenario globally develops in one of the future trajectories that we would consider the better ones. So we don't have to confine it to one, but the theme is within that range of futures which lead in the best directions. We could call that for this moment a cultural renaissance for humanity. And so the idea is basically that we want to play the game of what if. Don't necessarily even have to say what if all the time, but basically if we can then just try to imagine what would happen and what it could be, what events will lead to transformative moments. For example, the culture wars ending and becoming a kind of a cultural creativity explosion. That's one of the themes. How is the tensions in what we call culture war, or in the cultural exchange, or in the public conversation, let's say that is resolved in a way that it leads to a vast enhancement of understanding, of mutual understanding, which leads to an evolution of all the different belief systems by people becoming able to listen very attentively and get a high level of understanding of the different ideas in the room, of the different knowledge, and what it applies to, what it may not apply to, what could be a higher level synthesis, etc. So for example, one of the big themes then will be cultural evolution. And obviously through the internet being used as a tool, but then I would suppose very new uses of the internet, possibly new programs as well. And that's also a category, which is our relationship with the machines and with software. So what I thought I would do is to just try to keep this to topics, to keep a certain structure. And then I'll just go through one topic at a time. And then we just basically just imagine some positive development in this area. And also, if we wish, we can imagine what it will be like in the year 2050 when humanity has become unified. So that's also the idea behind this thought experiment, is that at some time within the next 30 years, there comes this enormous unification of humanity, that we figure out some kind of way to come into a global dynamic where there's a harmonious interaction. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what you call it, because the whole point then is that it becomes a kind of a harmonious interaction between the people, between the communications, between the behaviors, between the movement of goods from place to place, within the coordination. And that through by eventually entering into a harmonious coordination when then experiencing this from the inside. The idea is that we are in a superposition to be able to continue that, and that we might have solved all our problems. So this is the big idea as a thought experiment for the time being. Maybe one day it will be realized. That's certainly my hope. But for the time being, it's a thought experiment. So what if we succeed? What if we figure this stuff out? What if we actually evolve? What if we actually awaken? What if it actually comes a society of unconditional love, of truth, of real community, of explosive creativity and intelligence and wisdom that can really build on the best from all places in the world, which obviously is the potential that we have now that we have this network that connects people around the world, and we can send signals with the speed of light, etc. So the development of the internet, of course, is another way we could frame this. Which direction will the internet go? How will the pages look? What will happen with blockchain technologies? What will happen with governments? What will happen with food production? And what about spiritual communities? What about religion? What about faith? What about our relationship with the unknown and with psychological development? So I think this is also one of the key topics in my view, because I think that some kind of new community seems to me as most likely to be a part of this scenario. So if we really figure it out, then I think that what's going to happen is some kind of conscious community which can serve lots of needs, and it can certainly be a highly spiritual evolution that can happen if this goes in the right way. And then we may come onto the really big issues, and then you could, for example, ask what would be reasonable faith, and what would be, let's say, a religion that can relate with a larger unknown, while at the same time remembering the mystery of it and not being tied by dogmatic forms, which is the typical criticisms of the problems associated with religion. So the regeneration of religion or spiritual community, or maybe it can be called something else. This is another part of the quest that we can dream into. And then, of course, there's the question of science, knowledge production, knowledge development, knowledge sharing, education system. How does this whole system work? What about the health system? How does this work? And maybe it's one system that can combine all of these things. So there's lots of possibilities here. But I thought it was good to just mention a few of these things, because then we have some themes that we can speculate around. And here comes Alex. And so I thought we could just do a little round. And I'll just mention to you, Alex, that we're doing some CoVisioning, and I'm now going through a couple of main topics. And basically, we want to dream into how does humanity succeed in this area. So we're talking about the futures where humanity really shines. That's the whole focus here. So we're not concerned about any of the futures where we run into trouble. Well, maybe we run into trouble, but in these scenarios, we use that trouble to evolve, one would suppose. But that's basically the main theme. So then I wrote several topics: the economy, government, science and knowledge production, spiritual community, art, film, music, regenerative communities, villages, initiatives. There's the question about the internet, about social media, how we use computers, and spiritual communities, how these develop. And then relationships. What about close relationships? What about families? What are the good marriages of the future? And what are the good family dynamics? When do the family dynamics really work? When does the education really transmit wisdom between generations? What about intergenerational community? Where does this fit into the picture, etc.? So that's just an overview of the topics. And I think we can just start doing a round, and anyone who feels they want to say something can do. But let's first then begin with the economy. And we can also write in the chat. But it's possible to basically talk about anything we want, I think. I'll just begin asking about this for the time being. We'll just see where we go with it, basically. So yeah, Tyra.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, I'm going to share with you something that I feel is successful in society and could become more successful in the future, as if, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And just go
So
with that.
I can't really, I'm not really sure about the economy part other than sharing, which then becomes kind of a socialist type idea. But the thing that I came to when you said wisdom shared, there's some great programs where 20-somethings, college students, are living in elder care homes. And so college students are coexisting with elder people, and they're sharing that wisdom. And I thought it was just a brilliant program. You know, college students are low on housing, it's expensive, and in 50 and older communities, they're coming together. And I thought that that was really beautiful. And then also having older people have daycare centers in senior living centers so that older people are in charge of the younger people and the younger people learn from the older people. So that wisdom shared, that word shared keeps coming up to me. So there's my little conversation starter.
Yeah. I just think maybe we don't have to be so stuck up on the topics. Let's just go with it, I think, because this is great. So this is knowledge sharing between generations, where they use the housing structure to inspire that to work. Yeah, I love that. Makes me think knowledge sharing between generations. Seems
It's
like
truly
one of the topics.
coexistence.
That is, yeah, generative coexistence.
Intergenerational coexistence. Leveraging and complementing generations.
So the best from the different generations we can learn together. You have the energy of the curiosity of the kids. You have the I can do anything of the people in the 20s. You have the sort of more maturity that's beginning to grow later. And then you have the sort of reflection on the whole life, lots of ideas that developed further. And this sharing just leads to all of the collective understanding to just increase, right?
Yeah, imagine that village and they are sharing art. You know, older people are teaching younger people how to paint, and also economics and history, all of those things in that kind of coexisting village, I think would be really exciting if we saw more of that.
Yeah. I also think this touches on the psychology part that you were talking about, Glenn, which is a lot of younger generations, especially my daughter's generation, has a lot of anxiety about the future. And there could be a lot of, let's just say, wisdom and possibly some calming effect if the older generations are actually able to put things in perspective for the younger generations. And that reinforces, as well as clearly the younger generations can help the older generations with their iPads or iPods or iBrains or iNecs or iEyes or whatever it is going to be in the next few years. By the way, I was brought up in a multi-generational household since I'm Asian, you know, since my grandfather had a hospital and he had 11 kids. And then once they got, you know, married, you know, I had lots. I have, like, on my dad's side, probably over 24 cousins just on my dad's side, probably about close to a dozen on my mom's side. So there's about 36 cousins I have. So Asians are quite comfortable in intergenerational homes. I mean, this is what you're talking about is clearly more than just a single family or seed tree, but, you know, it's kind of a kibbutz type idea as well as, I guess you might say, intentional villages. So I love this idea. I think that we're too siloed from a generation to generation standpoint right now. This whole Western notion of I got to go out and strike it out on my own and make it on my own is just very, I mean, that atomic notion has severed a number of previously possible connections, which I think are really great to rebuild. So I love that idea.
So would you say that in Asian culture, there's been a practice of intergenerational knowledge sharing for a long time, and that this is something that you know how to do, and it's been done successfully, and it works? I think that's another big part of this discussion. What are some of those mechanisms that we have seen to really work? So could you say more about that?
Me?
Yeah, just what comes to mind about that.
Start with childcare. The fact that, you know, my mom and dad were really young when they still had me. My mom was still going to medical school. So my grandparents basically raised me. And, you know, I just had cousins to play with. And of course, knew their parents, which were my uncles and aunts, you know. So there's a lot of just mutual reinforcement and care and looking after, and not to mention cooking, not to mention the large meals. Mealtime is just like, that's intergenerational right there. So I think intentional mealtime is one of the most important family traditions that I try to support. And then from there, everything else is possible, you know. What happened to you? What about that? Oh, try this, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's mealtime, which then can go into smaller one-on-ones if necessary.
Yeah, that already seems like that's a whole system for knowledge and for just a community, a supportive group of people that get together, they sharing a meal and just everything that can go around that. So this ties in with an idea that I've had for a couple of years about these, I call them super events. So it's an event where people get together under beneficial conditions, and you can have a lot of different things that happen. It's a lot of synergies, but it's a ritual. There can be certain rituals that help strength that sense of this community sense, just being together there. And that's another big question. What are some of the best rituals that we've seen in human culture? It's another. Yeah.
I don't know if it's rituals, but I really loved the history of the Victory Garden in America, also England. The idea of, instead of a lawn, you have your garden in the front yard. And I would really like to see that come back. I'd like to see us get rid of those lawns and start planting gardens in the front yard rather than grass, because that brought the community together. People walk by, they comment on the killer squash you're growing, and people are then sharing produce with their neighbors. People are cooking with their vegetables and sharing that with neighbors. And I think if every new build had some sort of vegetable beds, raised beds in their front yard, that could transform entire neighborhoods on so many levels. And again, it's that intergenerational. It's young people and old people, everybody coming together because we all want to eat and we all want good, fresh food, or at least dream of that. So imagine if every apartment building had gardens on top on the roofs for the children, I just think that would be really transforming as well. If every single resident had some sort of greenhouse, garden, something that was just, of course we grow our own food.
Exactly, like a roof garden. Imagine you have these apartment buildings and you got a roof garden and people can meet up there. There can be plants, vegetables planted that can be, taken for the people who live there. But just as a social meeting place, just be able to go for a walk on the roof. I mean, this is an amazing thing. I mean, well, why haven't we done that more? Why haven't we built more buildings where we have this beautiful top roof section as a sort of a meeting point for the whole building? Because then you also have a fantastic view, and there's nothing like that feeling of looking out over a large landscape. That it's also something very special about that. So that's a fantastic, very specific idea.
And also vertical gardens on apartment buildings. There's so many solutions to growing food, but no one, so I'd like to see a future where guerrilla gardening is all the rage.
Exactly, guerrilla gardening. Yeah. So is that like on the outside of the buildings? For example, you can have a vertical garden sort of a cylinder. I definitely see that is a part of this future. I'm pretty sure something like that. So
with the rise of diabetes and other health issues, and the food deserts, and the fact that people are starving when there's so much food waste, it seems like there's so many easy solutions for that.
It makes so perfect sense too, because one of the first things you want with food is you want good quality. And if it's fresh, if it's locally, the closer it's made to the person who eats it, it's just pure benefits. You cut away
and seasonal.
Yeah, you save time. It's seasonal. It's just a pure win solution. So yeah, actually, I should mention, I was looking at this talk with Schmachtenberger and Weinstein, and one of the things he talked about was design, and that we have the science where we give ourselves these false constraints. We only explore a very, very small part of the science space. And if we could just think bigger in terms of design, like we're just doing with that example, there can be these incredibly simple solutions that are just vastly superior in terms of saving time, in terms of energy, and actually in terms of maximizing the interests of all people, because no transportation, you get high quality, that's what the person who wants to eat food wants, and you just save enormous resources. So that's a fantastic thing. So I'm curious then, also Barry and Alex has been not saying so much yet, but it's basically open floor to anything. I mean, anything you see in the next 30 years that would be a very, very good development. It could be anything.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm looking forward to is an idea that almost nobody's ever heard of, and if they have heard of it, they probably don't think very much of it. But it's a governance model that transcends all the classical governance models that we have used since the dawn of government 6,000 years ago. The governance model that I would like to see is one called technocracy. The way technocracy works is you still have voters, you still have a democracy, but what you're voting for are objective goals of the culture, what you want to see happen, but not how to make it happen. So for example, when JFK says we're going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, the 1960s, and bring him back alive, that was a goal. But then they delegated the responsibility to achieve the goal to a technocracy called NASA. NASA was an organization comprised of technologists, scientists, engineers, mathematicians who knew how to do it. And they were given a budget and authority, and they figured out how to reach the goal. But it wasn't Congress who wrote the code for how to get to the moon. All they did was say, okay, we're going to create a technocracy of people who really know what the hell they're doing, really have the brains and the education and the know-how, and they're going to make it happen. And we're just going to give them the goal. We have the National Weather Service. It's a technocracy.
So now I got a question for you with that. So let's say we want that model to solve this issue that's big in US now about voting, because there's two concerns that we want harmonized. Voting, it has to be safe elections. Everyone needs to trust it to the highest degree possible, and it needs to be easy. So like what would, for example, a technocracy could do then? Could they develop then a system that would make it completely certain that this vote was from that person, it's incorruptible, utterly incorruptible, and it's also simple? If you do it in the right way, would that, for example, be an example?
For example, you would create a technocracy called a voting system expertise, subject matter expert, blue ribbon panel, and they would solve that problem. They would say, what is the best method for creating a voting system that's incorruptible, that's fair, that's, has all the right qualities? And they would figure out how to make one that's incorruptible. Yeah. And it wouldn't be up to Congress or the state legislatures to come up with methods that, either do it or corrupt it. So the technocracy would be experts who know how to answer that problem and achieve the goal. They would just be given the goal.
Yeah, exactly. And that seems to depend on the goals being clarified.
Exactly.
Yeah, Sam.
So this is where I really like to blur the line between investment, vulture capital kind of industries versus political delegation. So I've often been dreaming about what happens if I take my tax dollars, whether it's a flat 10% or flat 25% or whatever it is, everybody gets a flat rate. But if mine turns out to be, let's say, $10,000, I should be able to take that $10,000 and says $5 goes to defense, $20 goes to healthcare, $30 goes towards schools, $5 goes towards, transportation, $10 goes towards the, national internet infrastructure, $5 goes to charity for this particular purpose, and just do an allocation across my tax obligation. And I'm not saying whether it goes to politics or political organizations or whether it goes to kind of a venture industry, but we need to be able to say, this is my set of priorities. You would have a different set of priorities. Somebody might say, okay, my allocation is only 8,000, but I believe so strongly, 6,000 of this I'm going to allocate towards national defense. They have a very different set of values, but that way we're voting with our own assets / tax obligations. I have been thinking for decades, maybe that is a seed of an idea which gets away from this one person, one vote silliness and is actually a much more considered way of what person's expression of priorities is. You'd have to make other accommodations for people who are not netting, anything that requires taxes. You would have to ask yourself, hey, if this person is living at a level that we're not requiring this person to pay taxes, how do we let that person express their priorities? They should still be able to, but it might be weighted less, is what I'm saying. Over.
Yeah, Alex.
That system, Sam, sounds like it might work because it would the people who need that money, like the military on one hand or the hospitals and then to lobby the taxpayers for their, to lobby the taxpayers so that they would direct their taxes in that direction.
Yeah. Not just to lobby, but to do quarterly or annual reports and be accountable, because that's how investors work it, right? They look at the annual report, they look at the 10Ks or whatever, at least in this country, and say, are you making silly errors or are you making wise judgments? And therefore I will either increase or decrease my investment in you, decrease possibly down to zero, if I don't believe in what you're doing.
So one of the core components here is to have an accurate knowledge of each person's priorities. Is that sort of the foundation for this? Yeah,
I'm saying at one extreme, all the organizations that are already existing, take NASA, for example, take the Department of Homeland Security, take the Department of, just the hospital down the street. Every entity that requires funding has basically a cup. Okay, it's holding a cup and I can toss dollars into that cup. And I can do it across as many organizations as I want. There's like 10 million companies in this world, in this country. And if I've got $10,000 as my tax obligation, some might get a nickel, some might get $2, I could do it at that level of granularity if I choose. I can choose to help voting rights in Georgia, even though I live in Washington State, because that's where I want to put my money, right? Or I could say, I only want to put it into local infrastructure because we don't have enough roads or we don't have enough trees or we don't have enough cows, whatever the heck it is. So yeah, at one extreme, it could be everybody can even vote down to the specific penny, at least in the US model, okay? Whatever currency applies could be split up however one does it.
Okay. I want to see if we can go further here. First of all, I wonder why are these institutions there in the first place?
I'm saying at any delta t, at any time t dot n, there's always ongoing ventures, ongoing organizations, right? So we don't want on time zero just go from scratch. That doesn't seem to be realistic. So we have to look at what's already ongoing and decide, do we want to continue funding those? Or do we want to create new organizations? Or do we want to take entire organizations and say, you're not worth your time. I'm going to drop you, until you become accountable and aligned with what the citizenry state are our priorities.
So is this then dependent on you being able to see what that organization is doing and what their initiatives are? So,
Exactly.
so we're talking about then total transparency,
Exactly.
because then this makes sense. I don't think it makes sense for me to give $10 to an organization I really don't know anything about what happens with it. But if I see many organizations that I know something about, and I know their initiatives, and I know that it's a completely trustworthy thing, and it's a good thing, and I know the results, and the results are also transparent, and it's one of those systems that's transparent because it works so well that you just want it to be transparent so everyone can just see how well it works. Then I think we're really talking.
Yeah, I mean, transparent to the degree that, let's say we have an organization that's doing great work, you know, and yet the CEO is making, you know, $80 billion a year. And now we have a different organization that's doing great work, but the CEO's at like $300,000 a year. You and I might make that decision differently, right?
Yeah. Alex,
So,
what do you think here? If you had something.
It sounds like something that came up involved with the Eco Villages Summit. And there's a lot of noise around this topic of sociology, sociocracy. So I just wondered if any of you have looked into sociocracy, because this is close to what we're talking about here. It's like an open government and open departments.
yeah.
And
Open departments, yeah.
And open corporations that deal with people, need customers. And so they have an open section in their corporation that shows those customers what benefit that corporation gives back to the community and the environment especially.
Let's roll with that. So what benefits do the corporations serve in the next, let's say the next 10 years? Let me take one example. I know people love to criticize Amazon, but I'm extremely happy about the fact that I can have one click and I can find any book among an enormous number of fantastic books, and it's also very cheap. And that seems to me as an example of something very valuable, that there are some real valuable network effects in their concept. So I have this theory that Amazon and also Facebook and probably several others were companies that had a kind of a genius idea at the bottom of it. And then this has been mixed in with many other elements, like, for example, advertising and so on. And but I guess the question is, what would this be in a society where sort of the role of the concept was different? So okay, let me just go with this little. Facebook, what I mean is brilliant is the page of one person, the ability to form friendships between people, the ability to create groups that all people can go into, the ability to send private messages, and the ability to personally choose how your page is going to look. That's not an area they're very impressive, but that's certainly, I would say, is a part of the genius concept. And I think this concept is a fantastic concept. It's no surprise that social media became as big as it was, but then it got mixed in with advertising, and it got mixed in with various things, and there's dynamics for propaganda and not enough creative, brilliant stuff happening in the Facebook groups currently. So in many ways, we can say that it's a brilliant idea that so far hasn't been used to anything close to its potential. And I think that's the case also with Amazon, with Google, with all the big companies. that they've created something very genius, and it's gotten mixed with elements that come from different places. But I'm wondering what place it would have in a much simpler society. But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but let's just roll with this question Alex brought up then. Corporations and the business sector. What is a healthy business sector? What is a good corporation? Yeah, Tyra, go for it.
So I just heard a story about a California casino, Indian casino. And during the pandemic, they gave everyone, all of their employees, raises rather than laying them off. And it was a gamble. It was a huge risk. It was a financial, the CEO of the casino said, you know, you save money for a rainy day. This was a rainy day. And as a result of all of those employees getting a raise rather than the opposite, their whole lives have been transformed. You know, they interviewed the different employees. You know, one woman saying she could now afford to buy braces for her daughter. Another person, you know, going to college can now afford to, you know, pay his classes for his books. And that to me is a great corporate model. You know, they invested in their employees, and now the employees are invested in doing a good job. They feel valued and they feel valued. That's the underlying thing, to value your employees and not use them as someone to build you up. Use them as, you know, we are a family, we're in this together, and these are tough times. And I just loved that model. I thought that was a great model, and it was a huge gamble.
Great. It's a lot like a family. It's almost ordered together a good team. They're solving a certain issue and they're doing something good in the world. That makes sense. Sam, did you have something? He might have gone off now. Kayla, did you want to say something or?
So my brother works for this international company, and they don't have a vacation policy. You can take vacation for as long as you want, whenever you want, whenever, like wherever. Before the pandemic, they actually were remote, and they're the business that can be remote. But I found it really interesting because my brother works harder for this company than any other companies because of all of the benefits that they give them, all of the trust that they give their employees. Again, it's a huge risk, and I haven't seen anything in the news about this company, but just, you know, my brother working for them, and, you know, he actually has the COVID-19, contracted it this past week, and I said, well, you do know that here in California, there's a new law that passed on March 29th that says that employees or employers are, if you contract the COVID-19, you are allowed to get paid up to 80 hours and, you know, take that time as a break. So I was encouraging him to use that. And he said, no, I'll probably just take 3 days off and then work. I mean, I'm working remote. The company's been really good for me. So now there's loyalty, you know, and the desire to work because this company has given its employees trust. And I think that's really important. You know, there's a saying that says something to the fact that you shouldn't be paying for a person's past, you know, another person's mistake. And I feel like trust in corporate for its employees, you know, there needs to be more of that.
Trust seems to be one of those things that are one of those typical ingredients when it is working. Sam, what did you have there?
Well, I was going to throw in another orthogonal direction. I know each of these topics could be another whole session on its own. But in light of what's been in the news lately around Neuralink, I don't wonder if you guys have seen this, what was it, a rodent of some kind playing Pong using a Neuralink connection to their brain. So I think this brain cyber connection in 30 years, undoubtedly, okay, that's plenty of time enough for us to make really interesting, and dare we use the word progress, towards human brain connections, okay? I'm not sure if we're all gonna have jacks in the back of our brains, our heads, but something like that is gonna happen. You know, we've already got brains playing Pong just via thought, not even human brains. So I think this whole idea of, are we going to be augmented in some way with, let's say, compute power that might be unlike any that we currently envision today, where we're plugging into a memory that has granularity beyond we can even think about with our human brains. Or to be able to interact, not in conversation, but thought to thought, mediated by technology. I mean, this is science fiction stuff, I know, but 30 years is a long time to play with. On the other hand, we'll probably just be sending, you know, thoughts and pictures and visualizations of cats to each other. But at least we'll be doing it through this, you know, brain technology, brain channel.
Yeah, Alex, what do you?
That neural insert was used on children with disabilities. Severely disabled children were able to use the computer with their brain to play ping pong or some game. It wasn't a rodent, it was a real human. So they're doing
No, this week it wasn't a real human. This week there was actually a separate, very specific. If need be, I will find it.
Yeah, I saw it yesterday, I think it was, and it was about Elon Musk's device, and he's
That's
using
right.
using it on real humans.
So how does that? How far has it gone so far in terms of the communication between that device and the brain?
Well, the disabled children who can't use their hands to type on the keyboard can use the computer with their eyes, just moving their eyes, or just thinking of a thought. Think of a birthday cake in your mind, and that if it lights up birthday cake on the screen, you blink twice and say yes, and you're teaching the machine learning of the computer that where that part of the brain is that thinks birthday cake. So it knows in future, if it sees that pattern again, it's got a fairly good idea that you're thinking about food, for example. It might then give you some options. It's in the early stages of development, so, you know, Albert. Barry.
Right, Barry.
There's a chap at the Media Lab, you know, for about 10 years, I was a visiting scientist at the MIT Media Lab. And among the faculty there is a chap that shared the office next door to us. His name is Hugh Herr, Herr. And as a young man, he was into rock climbing. He was a very good rock climber. And one time he had an accident and he ended up losing his legs. His legs froze in a rock climbing accident, and his legs were amputated, I think just below the knee. And he became a faculty member at the MIT Media Lab, and he developed artificial limbs. And I don't mean the kind that you get from India, which are just, you know, pieces of wood. These were high-tech artificial limbs that had electronics in them and muscles and all kinds of things in them. And he eventually was able to hook up the electronics of these artificial limbs, these artificial legs, to the neurons coming out, the signals coming out of your motor cortex neurons. And over a period of about a decade, he got to the point where people could literally walk on these artificial limbs using the regular motor cortex as if they were driving the regular limbs. And in fact, these limbs were better than human limbs because he could add features to them that you didn't have in human limbs. And you can go all the way back 10 or 15 years and find videos from CBS 60 Minutes and others demonstrating, you know, the functionality of this. So connecting human neurons, motor neurons, to external devices has been around now for about 15 years. It's becoming extremely advanced. I think even Elon Musk, was it Elon Musk or maybe it was the chap up in New Hampshire who was developing artificial arms with fingers that were artificial, that could be manipulated the same way. So this is not new technology. It's just getting incrementally better and better every year.
So that's a big and interesting one about yeah. What's the dynamic between us and these systems?
Yeah.
Yeah, Alex, what do you?
We've taken a leap in evolution with technology, because remember when we had tails, when we were still in the trees, we had tails, but we've lost those tails simply by not using them. We came out of the trees and started walking upright. We didn't need the tails anymore, and they disappeared. So if we've got electronic devices and drones to carry us around, it's like we got bicycles and motor cars, so we don't need legs, but we haven't lost our legs yet. So it's a slow process.
Yeah. Tyra. Yeah, I have to unmute.
You're muted.
Yeah. There.
So I love this kind of brainstorming. I can do this all day long. So I love the idea also in the next 30 years of cooperative farming. So the average age of the American farmer is now about 65 years old. And those farmers will be retiring soon. And there are no young people, farmers, coming up the ranks. Farming is no longer considered
go-to career,
a high-level occupation or a career. Like, you know, most kids don't go to college to become farmers now. But if you do have some farmland or even large corporate farmland, to divide that farmland up and let it become a cooperative farm, wherein young people could come and work a quarter acre of land, and another family could, work an acre, and then everybody has a share in the farm, and also donates the residual food. So I love the idea of this cooperative farming, because it does give young people an opportunity to step into the farming role and make it something, because young people can't afford big farms. They can't afford to compete. They can't afford the equipment, any of it. But if they work together, then everybody could afford it. And I think that that's a very exciting thing that may very well have to happen, because corporate farming is destroying everything.
Yeah, that was with farming, it's cooperative farming, and we spoke about also farming close to where people live. Maybe we're talking about even hybrids between cities and natural places. Like, Oslo's the closest city to here. It's a fairly green city, has some green areas, but it certainly has elements to it that you would call a city in a more classical sense. But I'm wondering, will it be combined cities and gardens and farms, for example? Joshua, good to have you here. We are doing some co-visioning today, so we're just basically sharing some dreams, ideas for the next 30 years.
The whole time I was under Jimmy
Okay.
Chi. I just switched from the phone. So
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I thought you might have been there. So yeah, so basically there's this, but then this interests me a lot. What about these places which can have the best of the big city and the best of the countryside? Because I've seen some of these gardens, the most beautiful gardens created. They are really works of art, and And you can have also areas where you sort of just let things play its own, like larger parks. So imagine like these hybrid cities with parks and farming all in one. So it's a superstructure, and you can have the transportation can be in a subway system. For example, let's say it's a very good subway system. It's one of those things. It's very easy once you've created it. But you can also, I mean, just have people walking, because walking is always a great way to move around. But the whole point then is that basically you will have everything within reach. So imagine, for example, you have a project, you have the big idea, you get an investment, and then you can begin buying land in relatively cheap areas, and then you can begin building these hybrid structures, sort of, I don't even know what to call it, but imagine even more investment, more interest, more people behind. We may even begin building continents on the oceans. Could there, for example, be civilizations that could use the power of the waves and the winds, like kind of multi-purpose platforms? They already have oil platforms, which is pretty advanced already. Should be entirely possible to create a kind of a multi-purpose platform in the ocean that is connected to the ocean floor, and then out from that build a kind of a floating city. And these can then be experimental civilizations where we can try different formats for life. And so I also see that can be combined with this. So, but there was a few unanswered questions. We talked about companies, work culture, this team spirit in a company, and valuation of the employees. But the question I had then is, what do these companies do? Let's say a normal work life. What do we do? Let's say you're gonna work today. What is work in the beautiful futures? Could it, for example, be that we have automatized all the standard repetitive things? So what's left for humans is just being together, social activity, which for some can be work. It can be philosophy and high-level thinking. It could be research of all kinds. It could be entertainment of all kinds. But basically everything's social, right? That's not going away. On the contrary, automation might create a situation where we can really spend all our time doing social things or doing very creative things. So that's another issue. I'll just open up, and maybe some of you have some ideas. But yeah, what is the work of the future? What are we working in the next 30 years? Maybe Josh, you have some thoughts. And we're talking about the best work you can imagine. Anyone have any? Josh, go for it.
Well, I just want to engage the room and see if anyone else. I think Alex has something first before I go for it. Let me see if there's anyone else.
You want to go first, Alex?
There's a motive each individual has when they choose the work they're going to do, when they choose the career path they're going to embark upon. And the motive is usually what pays the most, what gives you the most income. So if we've changed the income to kudos instead of dollars, something tied to the value that's also, you can use it to trade, and you can also use it as a sign of your commitment to the collective, because not only has it got the dollar value, it's also got a, tied to that is also another value, that is the community value. Shows that you are concerned, you are spending your money on sustainable, reusable items, and that increases the value of your dollars as well as the kudos. That sounds like a great idea, because we've got computer systems that are technologically advanced enough to be able to do that automatically. Why aren't we doing it is the question. I think some groups are doing it or trying to do it. Over.
Ira, do you want to go first, and then Josh?
Oh, sorry, Joshua, you go.
No, I was. Did you see me nodding my head? I don't know if you could see me on the screen.
Yeah.
I was like, please.
Yeah,
I'm not even.
because it seemed that he wanted you to go first.
I'm the guy that loves the future, and I'm always talking about this stuff. So I think Glenn's like, okay, what is Josh? What does Josh want in the future? But I want to listen to what you say, Tyra. So I'm just listening.
Yeah.
I'm loving the old people and the young people. I love that this morning. Thank you for saying that.
Conservationism, future jobs. How do we keep the species on the planet still on the planet? So I think that in the future, if we have choices, I think conservationism would be a much bigger job in the future if people could actually, like Alex said, you know, right now so many of us are just in survival mode. We're just barely making ends meet, and a lot of us aren't even making ends meet. So the idea of doing something that you're passionate about might be very much a luxury for most people. But if those basic needs are met, food, housing, education, medical care, then we can do some really amazing, like you said, some big thinking ideas. But I think conservationism of the species would be a bigger priority in the future.
Yeah, so you mean like, let's say
whether it's saving the bees or the elephants or.
So we have a system in place for our basic needs, and then a lot of us can actually work full time on conserving these natural ecosystems and
stewardship, more in stewardship.
Do it professionally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hollow chain crypto is a good idea for blockchain, not for Bitcoin mining, but for the fact that they can use that system for a green coin. And a green coin is one that doesn't burn energy mining cryptocurrency. It allows the transfer of value between users who are making choices by their shopping decisions that are wise choices for the environment and the conservationism. That way you've got a green coin growing, and people interested in conservationism will try to spend this green coin rather than the other currencies. It'll have a value, and it'll have an increasing, growing value, because the pressure on societies to change their ways and old habits is increasing as the temperature of the earth heats up. It's on an exponential rising path upwards, and we're still using as much CO2 this year as we did last year. It's not dropping for some reason, but the only reason we've seen a dip in the CO2 emissions is because of COVID. Less aircraft flying and less traffic on the roads. But you know, the COVID's only going to last a certain length of time before we have herd immunity, and we'll be back to normal. So back to the same old problem: emissions. And the only way we can control emissions is with law and technology. The corporations don't obey the law. Mining, especially the big powerful mining companies and military organizations, they would spend as much as they like building more ships, submarines, aircraft, missiles and defense systems, because it's there's big money involved with the factories that make these things.
So,
Huge
um,
profits.
for example, defense, right? The interest that wants to serve is protection, safety. So I guess in these futures, that will all change its meaning. Because we wouldn't need to defend against each other if it's all working. Then there needs to be a transition period towards that. Okay. No, there's many ways we can go here, but yeah, whatever do you want to share, Joshua? Go wherever way you want to.
Sure. I mean, this is bringing up so many thoughts, but like if we were to boil it down, it comes down to how do we count and how do we govern the counting? That's what I've been thinking about is mathematics, having long conversation with mathematicians and physicists, and like which one come first, the chicken or the egg? Did the math come first and then we created physics, or did physics, the motion of the planets, come first? And then we started counting the time, and then we created mathematics. And I think that's sort of a society problem is, do we create systems where we tell people how to interact with that system, or do we allow the systems to be emergent from what the people are naturally doing and then start counting and creating monetary systems of governance of what's emerging? And I think, that's the idea of capitalism is a great idea of just let it emerge naturally and then allow it to govern itself through some people get super rich and some people get super poor. And then hopefully it all balances out in the end. If you stretch it out over enough time, the money all feeds up to the greedy people that want it all. And then eventually it has to cycle back around. And depending on where you are in the cycle, it looks terrible or it looks amazing. If the money's being redistributed, it looks great. And go ahead, Barry, I see your hand up. I'll stop there.
There was a philosopher, I think he lived in the 1600s, and I'm pretty sure he was Italian. His name was Giambattista Vico, V-I-C-O. And he was thinking very much along the lines that Joshua was talking about, different governance models and how they might emerge organically and historically, because by the 1600s, you could actually look back on, almost 4,000 years of human civilization and observe lots of different governance models that had come into existence, had risen and fallen. And Vico noticed in particular 3 prominent species of governance models. The first model he noticed he called a theocracy. And it lasted for a certain amount of time, and it eventually failed and got replaced by the second generation, which he called an aristocracy. And the aristocracy survived for a certain amount of time, and eventually they failed and got supplanted by a third model that he called democracy. But democracy, actually all these systems, but in particular because we're in a democracy today, we can see it for real, they tend to be susceptible to corruption. And because corruption sort of grows and grows and grows and pretty soon becomes untenable, eventually democracies fail because of corruption. And Vico observed that what happens is that what supplants a democracy is it cycles back to theocracy again. So he notices sort of this 3-phase cycle: theocracy phase, aristocracy phase, democracy phase, and then a chaotic interregnum where things just went to hell in a handbasket. He called it the chaotic interregnum, and then back again. And you can see that Vico's model, theocracy, aristocracy, democracy, chaotic phase, and then back again, is a pretty good model for exactly what's happened in something like 4,000 years. And then along came a poet by the name of James Joyce. And he was familiar with Vico's model. And he thought, this thing about this chaotic phase is getting to be like the tail wagging the dog. We're seeing the chaotic phase more and more, and less of these well-defined phases. So James Joyce decided to write a novel incorporating Vico's model, but emphasizing the chaotic aspect of it, this chaotic aspect. And the name of the novel was Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is a very hard novel to read. As literature goes, it's considered one of the most challenging pieces of Western literature to read and digest and understand. But in particular, the very first sentence of Finnegan's Wake is the second half of a sentence. And the very last sentence of Finnegan's Wake is the beginning of that sentence. So as you read it, the very last sentence loops back to the beginning, just like that chaotic phase. So what Finnegan's Wake is, it's a parody or a satire or a send-up of this chaotic phase. But the whole structure of Finnegan's Wake is a retelling of Vico's model as a chaotic novel, virtually incomprehensible. And we're embedded in a culture that is, in terms of sense making, it's harder than hell to make sense of the culture we live in because there's so much bloody chaos in it. And we're having a hard time figuring out why are things so corrupt and so chaotic?
So how does this end?
Excellent question. Okay.
But that is the question today. So you have to go there before.
I'm glad you asked that question because it wasn't until the 20th century, essentially the beginning of the 20th century, with a French mathematician named Henri Poincaré, who laid the seeds of the mathematics of chaos theory. Poincaré basically gets credit. Now, he wasn't really the first one to play around with chaos. Another mathematician named Lagrange, back another century or so, played around with some observations of chaos in the three-body gravitational problem. If you have three orbiting bodies, like a sun, a planet, and a comet, he found that if you try to apply Newton's model of gravitational mechanics, the system was not a clock, it was chaotic. And the reason is because if you just have a planet going around the sun in a circular orbit, perfectly stable, it will repeat exactly periodically. But if you have a comet coming in an elongated orbit, every once in a while, as the comet crosses the orbit of the planet, it's a close call. And so the gravity of the planet will slightly bend the orbit of the comet into a new and different elliptical orbit. Right, and so it's not periodic anymore. And eventually you get a collision, not a near miss. Okay. So you have chaos and calamity. You have doom. So already Lagrange had realized that three orbiting bodies obeying Newton's model of gravitational mechanics is not a clock. And Poincaré took that observation and developed it into the core idea of what becomes chaos theory. That a tiny perturbation in the initial conditions eventually leads to a gigantic change in the ultimate outcome. A tiny difference in the starting condition eventually leads to an enormously different history.
Exactly, and that's why I wanted today.
Alex had a question.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't quite finished the story.
Okay.
So Poincaré writes this up around 1900, and then everybody probably forgets about it until the middle of the 20th century, when there is a person at MIT who's working out an atmospheric climate model. How does the stuff in the atmosphere move around as it's driven by energy from the sun and the rotation of the earth? And he has three differential equations. But the differential equations, he can't solve them by hand. It's too complicated. But he gets a brand new computer. This is around 1955. And he says, okay, I'm going to program this computer to compute the orrery, the dynamics of these differential equations, using mathematical techniques. He says, but first, to make sure I learn how to program correctly and don't make mistakes, I'm going to program a very simple model of a very simple solar system, just to make sure that I have it right. So he says, okay, by the way, his name is Edward Lorenz. So he says, all right, I'll just start with a big, massive sun and a planet in a circular orbit and a comet in an elliptical orbit. And it should be a clock, he thinks to himself, because everybody expects that the solar system's a clock, except it's not a clock. He can't get it to be periodic. and he's driving himself crazy. What am I doing wrong? He keeps adding more and more decimal places so he doesn't round off. Finally, another mathematician at MIT comes to talk to Lorenz. Lorenz says, how come I can't get this three-body system to be a clock? And this mathematician says to him, Eddie, did you ever hear of a guy named Poincaré? Lorenz says, Poincaré, who the hell's Poincaré? Mathematician says, you have rediscovered an obscure result from Henri Poincaré of half a century ago. The solar system's not a clock. It has a property that it departs from periodicity in a very subtle way that Poincaré first discovered. So this guy Edward Lorenz then takes it to the next step, and he says, holy shimoly, there's a whole new branch of mathematics that needs a name. I'm going to call it chaos theory. And Lorenz introduces the fundamentals of chaos theory around 1960 or so. And then it's still pretty obscure until a guy named Mandelbrot at IBM finds a way to visualize it with fractals. And then a New York Times science writer named James Gleick says, this is really interesting and nobody's ever heard of it. So he writes a book in the 1980s called Chaos Theory to introduce this mathematical concept of chaos theory to the general public because it's been so obscure and unappreciated for most of human history. And then once you have the mathematics of chaos theory, you can answer that question. How do I take a system that's inherently chaotic and regulate it so it's not chaotic?
Exactly.
And once you have the mathematics and the ability to solve the mathematics rigorously, you can turn around and say, we can get out of chaos. And cybernetic systems theory is the branch of applied mathematics that does that. You can create feedback control loops like autopilots on airplanes and ships and elevators and your cruise control. You can create feedback control loops that generate well-behaved, well-regulated systems in the face of dynamics that would otherwise lead them to go chaotic.
Now we've circled right back to the topic of today. Yeah, there's so many threads from here, but Alex, go for it first, but then we'll follow.
There was a small change in the United States way back before the Boston Tea Party or sometime around there, where they introduced freedom in the Constitution, and it was freedom to vote or freedom to not vote. That small decision, what resulted in only half the country voting in America. Now, when I looked up democracy in the dictionary, it said governance by all the people, not half the people. So you have not got a democracy in the USA. So how many think the USA is a democracy? Raise your hand.
Supposed to be a republic.
Okay,
Well,
so
the thing is, if countries like Australia and New Zealand, where they do have compulsory voting, they have good healthcare, good free education, school systems, and all these wonderful things that you haven't got in the US. The US is a mess. And the reason the US is a chaotic mess with corruption and what have you is because of that change early in history, that small change that allowed people the option to opt out of the voting system, to opt out of their responsibility to take part in the democracy.
but let's not lose the thread, because here it all connects. Because the reason the USA is not a democracy, the reason most democracies aren't a full democracy, is because the information system's not working. So we're back to this question of the chaos on the internet.
It's working, but it's not involving all the people. Democracy in the dictionary, democracy is the governance of the country by the vote of all the people.
And that requires an information sharing between all the people.
You know, the pyramids like that, with the elite at the top and the poorly educated working class at the bottom.
So now all of you three have something to say, I think, and I'm going to ask this question. So how does the chaos of the internet now become harmonized? So that's
slowly.
I think Tyra, did you have something? Or
Well, I'm
Gradually.
already off on my other idea. Which,
I think
mean,
it's
'cause I'm-
happened by degree. Sorry.
yeah. I'm
Yeah,
having
yeah.
kind of a hard time following that thought of where that goes 30 years in the future and is working. But another thing I would love to see in the next 30 years is the use of magnetic transportation rather than fossil fuel reliance. And the idea that cars could be slightly elevated using magnetics, and then all of those interstates underneath it could be greenscapes. And I love that idea, that no longer being so dependent on and also not having batteries. I mean, I appreciate that we're moving towards that, but I'd like to see in 30 years that we even lose the batteries, because those batteries have, they don't go away. So, but magnetic energy, I love the idea of that, even though I have zero understanding, but in this future 30 years, it'll be all worked out and it'll be fantastic in my world.
And maybe when we first fix the knowledge ecology, that will enable us to develop those solutions. So Joshua.
Just to keep the thread, I'm just wondering if, because Barry went into some very complex things, but I think he came out with a very simple understanding. It was very, thank you, Barry, for explaining, because I think it went over a lot of people's heads and it went over mine a little bit, but I just want to try to ground it a little bit, which is with these mathematics that Barry's talking about, it creates a system, and he used the word cybernetics, and that's what just flies over your head. What the hell is cybernetics? But what he's talking about is really complex mathematics that control the feedback loops. And what I heard Alex say is there was a feedback loop in the system back when they created the governance of the United States of America that was chaotic, if you will, or a bad feedback loop, which is democracy is supposed to be everybody, not just the 51% or whoever gets out to vote. And what Alex was saying, which makes a lot of sense, is if you only get 51% of the vote, you're dismissing 49, which is the state that America found itself in the last election. It's not actually what everybody wants, and it's not a controlled system. And what Barry was explaining is that when you have a controlled system like the solar system, that seems like a clock that's controlled, there are chaotic, tiny anomalies that change the entire system. So the anomaly that Alex was pointing out about democracy is not a tiny anomaly, it's a huge anomaly. And it's really fucking it all up. So I just want to say what I thought went over everyone's head is at some point in time in the history of technology and thinking and mathematics, we created systems that can control the entire world. And those are cybernetic systems that can take into account billions and billions and billions of trillions of points of data, petabytes of data, push back into the system and control how people govern and how people vote and influence elections. And there's been a lot of, documentaries on this subject that are so complex and crazy that it's like, no, you can't control people's minds. But there's mathematics, what I'm hearing Barry say, and I just hope that people understand this, they have figured out how to control not just 100 million, not just 320 million, the population of America, but billions of people's interactions with the entire system that is humanity, and create not governance, but influence the chaotic emerging that should happen naturally. And they're pushing information into your brain through the television, through radio, internet, social media, et cetera, and they're actually controlling mathematically the dynamics of thinking of millions of people in all these languages throughout the world. And this is a big thing. If people think it's not happening, they don't understand the math that Barry will explain.
So can you translate that into the language of futurism?
Sure.
So how do these cybernetic systems program us to work together in all-win relations globally at scale? And how do they help us awaken to objective truth?
Well, first to acknowledge that they exist. And there's a book by Kathy O'Neill called Weapons of Math Destruction. That's
But we're not interested in that. Weapons of mass awakening.
No. I didn't say mass. I said math. M-A-T-H.
Oh, yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, if you understand that there are systems in place that can control the probability outcomes of emergent behaviors of nation states, whether it be how you pay your taxes, how you vote on infrastructure, like I was explaining, it'd be great to have transportation devices that don't pollute, that are regenerative, that don't cause exponential problems in the environment with oil spills, et cetera, and so forth. All these chaotic systems that come with the technologies of oil, steam, and coal, and all these things of the industrial revolution that we're still using to this day that seem archaic, when we could recreate an entire clean energy future, we still have governance systems that are using the old models, and there are thinkings of specific people that are in power. Like I'll give a perfect example. I just watched this the other day. When they created the light bulb in the 1800s, they created a light bulb that could last 120 years. And all the light bulb manufacturers around the world got together and created an organization, a cartel, to manufacture light bulbs that were planned obsolescence, that would not last too long because it would cause light bulb sales to go down. If all the light bulbs lasted, they watched the light bulb sales go down in 1920s, and they said, we can't have this. So the problem that I see is that if the system is built on monetary functions, on creating more wealth for these light bulb companies, they will create technologies that are obsolete. And Apple is a very good case of that. They make a new model every year, planned obsolescence. They change it enough to where you need to have the round feature versus the square feature. And they make people think that you have to have the newest, the latest, and the greatest. And they make sure that they die. The batteries and the operating system do not work after 3 to 4 years. So you have to buy the new device. That thinking of planned obsolescence, you can take that thinking over into governance. And what Barry's saying is you can have a planned obsolescent governing system of theocracy that eventually has to move into some form of democracy, whether it be actual democracy or something that looks like it. And then that has to move into a form of anarchy and chaos. And in other words, there's people very smart up at the top of the giant, large, multi-global corporations that know all these things and have been educated on it.
But they don't know all these things because this is a pattern that's repeated in the past.
No, they do. They do.
Yeah, but they just know what's happened in the past. But that's not what we're talking about here. I'm saying, what if we decide we don't want this dynamic? We don't want to go back to chaos. We want to go from the current situation and into a totally different situation.
If every manufacturer of light bulbs got together and made sure every light bulb that you could buy on the shelf was worse than the ones that were created in the past,
that's stupid.
Wait, but think about this. How do you create a light bulb company that makes light bulbs that will last 150 years without being squashed by the 40 other light bulb companies in the world that are there to make sure if you do that, they will either buy you out, kill you, or take out your company in one way, shape, or form or the other, because you're ruining 95 or 99% of all the light bulb business in the world.
I'll tell you the answer. We do not tolerate that mob mentality. Fuck those people. And if they try that, they go to jail. We openly design a light bulb that's so good that it's enough for everyone. I'm
going to be quiet and let Barry talk, because that seems great if you can send them all to jail. but now you got no light bulbs. But
But
go ahead, Barry.
that was a
China.
kind of a joke.
You
But,
got to negotiate with China too, Glenn, a little bit.
but here's the point. If we create a situation of abundance of all the light bulbs needed, all the food needed, all the resources needed, all the energy needed, everyone has a home, everyone has freedom to move. There's no shortage of any basics. That's the foundation I'm speaking from here. Those issues wouldn't even exist. Those light bulb companies wouldn't exist. They just wouldn't exist.
But take the example of light bulb companies and turn that into nation states and leaders.
Same. China wouldn't exist. USA wouldn't exist. Europe wouldn't exist. It would exist in the way books exist in a library. It would be an idea that we remember from the past, but it wouldn't have relevance in a
Right, but let me just
globally
tell you what else
connected
would
society.
The water that goes to the house that I live in would not exist. The sewage system where my poop goes would not exist.
Yes, that would exist.
Mm.
Why not?
Who would create a massive
Who?
waste system for
human
millions of people in
beings-
Los
The
Angeles?
human beings would create it, but they wouldn't even have to create it because they've already created it.
How about flip it this
Well-
way? How about flip it this way? What if what if the phone that Josh held up is actually a miracle of technology, $1 billion worth of technology, 1959 dollars in a wafer-sized container that will last at least maybe 3 years? Like, that is a miracle.
Yes, man. I'm
But
gonna
planned
hit-
obsolescence is a thing, and Josh mentioned it.
Tyra has
Collusion
something
and
right
corruption. So,
So I just wanted to steer it back to we're already there. It's already successful. So Joshua, if that concept, that light bulb concept that you're talking about, if you could play it forward 30 years from now and it's working, how would that work for you? How do you see that idea changing from what the old model is to the future when it's really working? What would that look like to you? And maybe I just want you
No
to
problem. That's a great
Yeah.
thing. And I see, Alex, your hand up too. And if you have something that's pressing that you need to say right now, I want to give you that floor, the opportunity. I don't want to go on a rant.
Yeah,
The,
Alex.
the corruption that's preventing that from happening is because the captains of industry, the people who make light bulbs, lobby the Washington with billions of dollars to get the right people in power so that they can ensure they will continue making those short-lasting light bulbs. That's the corruption in government because of our broken democratic system.
So how does that end?
The only way you can fix it is by changing the US Constitution with an amendment that gives people the duty, a national duty to vote every year in the federal elections and local elections. If you don't have that, then it's business as usual.
Well,
After the court.
I think it's needed much more.
Well, I think Barry
yeah.
Barry made it really clear is it ends when an anomaly in the system happens, and that anomaly is a light emitting diode is an anomaly, because the way that they were making the filaments, they could control that cartel because of those filaments. But when someone creates a technology that's cheaper to manufacture, that can get to market and take out those cartels, then that system ends. And those are the anomalies. And this is personally why I love science, is because every so often science creates an anomaly, like a calculator, a small little device that puts a huge, giant, big supercomputer that's out of hands of everybody's reach into the hands of the masses. And it starts off at $340 for a Texas Instrument TI little calculator, and eventually through abilities to manufacture at scale. And so what ends something is when you can take a small anomaly and get that meme or that thought out to the whole world, and not just control the IP, the intellectual property of that technology, but allow for anyone to open source it so that anyone can create a calculator at scale. So it's when you take the ideas and the manufacturing processes and you allow that to be utilized ubiquitously throughout all of society, where anyone can create that. And what happens in governance systems is governance creates laws, like you just said, let's lock them up. By creating laws that govern who can do what, controls the entire system itself. It's the
So
law
basically,
govern.
do we then have to just get rid of copyright? Is that what you're pointing towards?
No, I'm not saying we have to get rid of copyrights, because there's a reason to have copyrights.
But we won't need that reason anymore, right? Because we've already evolved systems of reward for creative work. So why would we need any copyright?
I'll tell you why. So if you spend your whole life, let's just say, how old are you now, Glenn?
42.
Okay, so you're working on a technology for another 42 years. So now you're 84 years old, and you finish your work. Do you want to just give that to everybody? And maybe you have spawned, I don't know, 16 to 48 different children, grandchildren, you know, families and people that rely on you for their livelihood. Do you want to take your life's work, protect it, and allow that to bring value and allow that to sustain the lives of your family and your loved ones? Or do you want to just give it away for free and they get nothing? That's where the governance model comes in of intellectual property.
I think I have
just give it all away.
I think I have a better answer than those two alternatives. I would want to create a life's work that I would give away for free for every person in the world to use. And it would be of such a high quality that they could build it for themselves, use it for themselves. It could spread all over the world. And we create actual global abundance. And then we don't need any copyright. We don't need any of those problems. We don't have any economic problems. Everyone has what they need. We don't even need money. We don't need any of the old abstractions that we've organized our society around, because at that point we have a globally connected community of human beings, and it's the human beings who fix these things together with the machines. So think about it like human beings on a ball with machines in physical space. Let's get rid of all the rest. No governments, no copyright, no corporations, forget all about that. If we think in terms of human beings in physical space with machines, yeah, what then?
Okay, so let's just say that we're futuring today, and I love it. Thank you so much for starting off with this futuring.
That's the topic, yeah.
Let's say that was created and everyone gives it away for free. And there's one person, an anomaly in the system. So that system, let's just imagine that system's created, everything's open sourced, nobody owns anything, there is no money, everything's there. One person comes up with a technology and keeps it to themselves and doesn't tell anyone, and starts using that technology to control all the other people that are open source and giving, and start to control the system from within their one anomaly. Then that becomes, if I'm not mistaken, Barry, maybe you can help me out here, is that a theocracy at that point? If I am one person governing the system that's supposed to be open source and free, but I'm not telling people that I'm governing it, I'm using my technology to control that open system.
Can you make that more explicit? What kind of control would that be?
Sure. So I created a device that changes people's minds. So whenever I walk into the bread line, where I always get the same amount as everybody, meaning the baker's baking bread, there's no money, and they always give me like 3 loaves a week. And my device changes that person's mind and they give me 25 loaves. And it starts breaking the system down, because everybody's supposed to all be sharing evenly the resources that are open for everybody. And now I'm hoarding the bread in my house and not telling anyone. And the person that's giving me the bread, when new people come in and he goes, I have no more bread. I usually have plenty loaves for everybody. It's always abundant, but somehow, I don't know how, it's gone. And it's because I've created a mind-altering device that tells that bread maker to give me 20 loaves of bread every time I go there, and I take all the resources,
Okay.
and he's got to grow more wheat, and it just breaks the
Right.
whole system down.
But the behavior of the bread maker, that would be visible, right? So
Yeah.
so if this got any real life impact, it would immediately be visible and
Right. So
transparent.
then go to the next step where they come to me and say, the bread maker says that he gave it to somebody, we don't know who, because he can't remember because you controlled his mind. So someone figures out it's me, and they come to me, and then I control their mind.
But when you
And
say control the mind,
yes,
I mean,
I have a device that will go into the wavelength of your theta, beta, and alpha states, and I'll make your short-term memory forget, so you won't even know you had the conversation. Much like the movie Men in Black, where you press the button and the little device wipes out your memory.
so it's basically like a kind of mind implant or weapon that you're describing.
Right, but I didn't open source it. The point is not the weapon, but the fact that I didn't open source that and give everyone that weapon.
Of course you
I
didn't.
myself.
Yeah,
What's
of
to
course.
stop somebody from keeping something to themselves? If you live in a free and open society, what's to stop someone from hoarding and keeping things to themselves?
Well, the whole idea is that he wouldn't have anything to benefit by such a device because it would just create risk for that person.
Yeah, but he's just lazy and doesn't want to go to the bread lines and doesn't want to work within that open source system and just wants to
that
be a
would
jerk.
require less effort and less risk.
But
that
that's
person.
my point, Glenn. That person's not logical, altruistic, reasonable. That person is a sociopath and completely out of their minds, and they're not thinking clearly. Like when you say utopian societies, that's beautiful.
But if they're already in a dynamic where they have to make pro-social choices to gain any influence, and if they make non-social choices because of the transparency of the system, it's going to be observed. So people will immediately know that's not an actor I can trust. So I'm going to stay away from whatever that person brings. So from the other person's perspective, then if you have a certain dynamic that's already in place, right, of a certain value exchange, and it's a certain transparency, you have the incentives working. So if I invent something, I wouldn't want to keep it for myself because it wouldn't gain any traction.
But you don't invent something overnight.
That's also true.
But your point is good, Glenn, because you're thinking logically, you're thinking altruistically, and you're thinking in the benefit of the whole. And I guess let me just finish this last thought and then I'll be complete. If that's the case, that everyone is thinking in the benefit of each other, and everyone, meaning 7.9 billion, or if we future a little bit, that's 11.2 billion people are on that track. It only takes, and this was to Barry's credit, in chaos theory, it only takes one person to ruin that perfect system for everybody. That's my point that I'm trying to make.
And that is, I think, where you're wrong. Because if we have a system, it doesn't have to be 100%. If it's 80%, 80%
but it's been
of the people...
It's been proven, Glenn, that's exactly the model of the solar system. If Barry can explain it again so that you can really understand, any system you create that seems to be perfect, it takes one anomaly of one comet that can change the whole system. The chaos theory, that book from James Gleick, I don't know if you read that book, the chaos book.
No.
Have you read that?
Fabulous book.
It is a fabulous, it changed my life personally because it got me down the line of mathematics that has allowed me to think in terms of logic. And then studying humanity and sociology, like I spent 10 years in New York City just studying people, just going to the bars, going to the parties, going to the high society, going to the ghettos, going to all where humans interact. Humans are anomalous creatures. And if you look at every single system of everything, that whole idea of things tending towards entropy, it always works. And this is what I think Barry is trying to explain with any governance system. It will go into a flow state where for a certain amount of time, everyone will believe a certain thing, but new generations of people come up and say, I don't want to believe what my mom or my dad are telling me. I don't want to believe what grandma or grandpa is telling me. I want to create a system separate from the one that's working for everyone. And
I hear what you're saying, but I still feel that you have a lot of assumptions.
Well, let's hear other people in the room.
You're talking about things that have happened in the past, but the premise that I want to explore today is, what if we create a system that has so much harmony, so much synergy, so much intelligence that it's able to adapt to these things, so that single agents doesn't create any system level damage because it's immediately contained. It's by an enormous speed, which is possible.
That's been tried too, and that doesn't work.
This has never been tried on a global scale. None of this we're speaking about today has ever been tried. That's the premise.
There was a gentleman named Adolf Hitler that tried this.
He never tried this on a global scale with the internet. Didn't happen. Sam.
I think the instability that we're talking about here is for a system that's designed and then set and then let go. I think the key idea here is that there's always feedback. So if we have systems that actually take feedback in real time as things change, then you can still, as Buckminster Fuller advises us, trim your tabs. Constant trimming of tabs will keep these systems in some kind of dynamic relative equilibrium. If left to their own with no additional feedback, yes, they do get chaotic. They go chaotic, okay, chaotic. But that's not the model. The model does require constant real-time feedback. And if this feedback is given to every element or person or sensor or bot or AI in the system, then everyone adjusts accordingly. And then you get emergent properties. Let's say, we design a global governance model, right? And we publish it, we tap it into Granite, and it exists for all time, right? Sooner or later, shit's gonna happen. But if we take that system and say, okay, we have a way to amend it. And now we have a way to actually take all the world's information, all the best scientists, all the best meteorologists, all the best psychologists, all the best social scientists, and say, here's a model of what might happen, okay, and feed that back to everybody. And then everybody does a local decision that says, how can I take some action based on what I know? That changes the system. That creates a stability. Except for, and Josh is still correct, for the quote unquote 1% of psychopaths. And therefore, a governance model still has to account for those. And if you don't do that, the system will still break. That's why I do believe that knowledge systems, which are the basis of simulation systems, which are the basis of prediction systems, which then produce big sense makers, really on a global scale. And that the education system let everyone have access to this, to do their own what ifs, to do their own tweaking, their own trimming of the tabs, their own modification of how do they want to optimize. Do I want to optimize, let's say, childcare versus old age, shit like that, okay? Everybody tunes their knobs differently. But if everybody does it, emerging, there's a sense making that can emerge out of this. And this is the fundamental notion that I've been thinking about for the last 13 years, okay? Which is, you don't design a system and then set it free to just, wreak havoc. You have to have this global feedback mechanism, global thinking, global modeling, global simulation, global prediction, global decision-making, and fuck voting, okay? Voting is the mindless way of making decisions. This is the right way of making decisions. Voting is, government by idiots. That gives us where we are today. So Sorry for the minor rant,
No,
but
no,
you
this
need
was
the feedback
perfect.
mechanisms. You need the sense making. You need the feedback that pushes education and sense making to everyone, and then let everyone take their autonomous decisions and actions, and then watch for psychopaths.
This was
Those are the key
perfect,
elements, in my opinion. Okay.
Yeah, because I
Over.
think this ties well in. I want to hear what Barry and Josh have to think here, because it's a big issue. But I think it's important to tie this back in, that if
And
there
Colin
is
has
this,
his hand up. He's
yeah,
had
and
it up for a
Colin
while.
as well. That so what we're the issue here then is, if this education, this sense making emerges as you describe, and if that creates this kind of a culture renaissance, then the whole incentive structure and the whole psychological situation could also change. So yeah, Colin, do you want to go now?
Sure. I think Sam just came in and made a few points that I was trying to make earlier in the chat. One was about the voting. I put a link. I did a search on the Schmackenberger corpus and found the link to where Schmackenberger talks about voting. So I put the search results up there that you're becoming more familiar with, and then found the link and put that link as well to the video that we are actually, I think that's the one that we're trying to follow up on integrating into our conversations. So
Yeah,
there's a
with
link to that
Weinstein,
today, about the voting that Sam just said. And it's about being informed, right? Voting doesn't mean it's an informed vote. And Sam also made a point way early on about a weighted vote as well. And my early inclination hearing about this perfect world is it's not a perfect world. You can't just get to here from there by saying it would work if, and the two, from getting from here to there is trim tabs and redesigning and a lot of things, like realizing LED lights are a thing. You know, they weren't a thing when I grew up. There wasn't an LED light. Well, there was, but there wasn't for replacing light bulbs, right? That wasn't a thing. So, you know, so there's a lot of potential, but it's adjacent potential, I think, is the way that people look at it in systems thinking. You know, what are the possibilities that are actually available? And that comes down to constraints, cost, people's opinion. And the big one for me, which I was looping back to, Sam said weighted votes. I'm saying, well, I don't think everybody can vote. First of all, if you have in democracy, like I think there's some people who have been said that they don't, you know, they can't drive cars and maybe they can't vote either. I don't know if everybody can actually vote. But yeah, that whole idea of voting is very suspect unless you actually have that knowledge or understanding feedback loop, because you might just be voting because your community leader said that's the way you should vote, or your family member said it, and you really don't know much about it at all because you're learning code all day and you could care less about watching the news because it's just a bunch of lies anyway, right, Glenn?
So does this mean then we basically have to have knowledge, common knowledge? Josh,
No problem. I hear Sam is typing. Flat earthers. I've been thinking a lot about governing sociopaths, and it brought me to a spiritual decision within myself.
Here comes all the pokes.
Yeah, well, I'm going to poke a little bit. Sociopaths, in my opinion, are necessary because it challenges people's souls to grow and to have challenges of fighting these sociopaths, which can make a good person a great person. It can take a Mahatma Gandhi and turn him into a global leader that freed a country of the sociopaths in the British Empire. And a sociopath like let's just say the Nobel Peace Prize would never have been created if there wasn't a sociopath named Alfred Nobel, who was for sure a sociopath. His children did not like him. He made millions of dollars, which is in today's economy would be billions of dollars, in weapons of destruction, of dynamite, of terrible things that caused millions of people to be oppressed in the African continent because of this dynamite and these type of weapons. And there's a great movie that I just watched recently. I would recommend to you, Glenn, if you haven't seen it. It's called The Last Samurai, and it's a motion picture with Tom Cruise. But it's the idea of taking an old, established, beautiful, 1,000-year-old culture and destroying it with Western thought of weapons of mass destructions, which is muskets and rifles and Gatling cannons and cannonballs, to destroy the old ways of the samurai, which is the sword and the bow and arrow. And the ways of interacting, whether it be in war or ways of interacting in peace, those ways will change as the emergent system changes. And the one thing that we have on this planet that we've never had before, it's 7.4, or I don't know how many people are on this planet, but I believe it's 7.4 billion people at this moment in time sustaining life better than they ever have. Meaning we've cured a lot of diseases. We've created mass food distribution systems. They're not perfect. A lot of them create, health problems in the long run, but in the short term, it does create more life on this planet. So we are growing as a population on the spinning globe. And I think we've never had to sustain humanity at the scale that we're at. And I think what's really on our minds is what's going to happen. When I was a child, it was 4 billion. And I've only lived on this planet for 48 years. So what we're all thinking is, how are we going to continue a humanity system with 11 billion, with 20 billion? How is this going to continue? Where is this going to end? And throughout history, it always wipes out completely and restarts anew. And the reason why that's living for me is I just went up to the property that I was living at up in the mountains for the first time since the fire. And the whole place is burned. It is done. Like, there is almost zero. The couple trees that are trying to survive, it was a drought this year, and they probably won't make it. But underneath at the very bottom, I saw a couple little tiny oaks about to come up, and I saw a couple old oaks that got burned. At the bottom, under the root system, is coming up, and it will replenish. It's just going to take another 60 to 100 years. And systems always change in those directions. But trying to stop and create a utopian society where everything works for everybody, it seems great, but I don't think, if you just study not humans, but geology and earth systems and the earth itself, I can look at the mountains right here from my window and see the layers of millions of years that have been created on the side of the mountain. You can see it on the side of a hillside of decaying tree sediment and rock that was pushed down and just grows. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, we could create a system that lasted, let's just say, 1,000 years on this planet where humans are living great. But at some point in time, an asteroid is going to come and take us all out. And we could even create lasers out in Mars that can detect around the sun for these asteroids. But what Barry said that's so important is that there will be an anomaly that we never thought of an interstellar object that starts to come through that we never even planned for. And just, in other words, you can do this forever. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is, there's something spiritual or something greater than all of these probability systems that is the soul's purpose on this planet. And I do think that needs to be addressed.
I think that is actually what I'm thinking about when I'm describing this future, because all these ideas of a utopia described, it's got nothing to do with what we're discussing. The question, I think, is more, what would be a relatively stable global system where the sociopathic or destructive elements will be there. They will create some chaos in some places, but the system as a whole will be able to deal well with that. and be able to even use it as a means for further growth, like for example, spiritual growth that can be inspired by seeing by various challenges, let's put it that way. But I think if we want to frame the question well, it's not some, you know, childhood idea of utopia. It's more a question of what could it be, or what would be a relatively stable, relatively harmonious system of humans globally. And first, it doesn't have to involve everybody. It can be a global system of 1,000 first, then 10,000, then it can grow. But what would a stable equilibrium be?
Well, if you can grok, I saw Sam's
Yeah,
hand up, but
Sam,
I'm just saying, trim tabs, Glenn, look deeper into Buckminster Fuller's trim tab, and I think the answers are there, but that's just my humble opinion.
Trim tabs, yeah. Sam and Sarah.
Okay. I think that there's two notions here, Josh, that I'd like to respond to. One is this one that hardship empowers or enables growth. And the other is that psychopaths are necessary in society for us to do that. I think you can believe the first without the second. And the reason I think that is because, is it necessary for somebody to take an AK-47 and mow down 47 people? Or is somebody in Colorado mowing down 7 people sufficient? Or is somebody in Atlanta mowing down 2 people sufficient? Or is somebody striking down, you know, somebody to the point of unconsciousness but not death? Is that sufficient? Or is it somebody slapping someone? Or is this a parent berating a child? At what degree do we enable growth? And my point there is that one's level of sensitivity is what's being asked there. In other words, if it takes 47 people for a country to say, oh, we got to stop this, without doing it at 7 people dying or 5 people dying or 2 people dying or somebody being oppressed or somebody being, you know, mistreated, etc., then that really says they're very, 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 very insensitive as a society, and that our sensor systems, our senses, are very insensitive. Whereas the more we grow, the more we experience, the more we're observant, the more we're able to really pay attention, to be present, then the smallest indicators will be sufficient, rather than requiring that 47 people be mowed down by an AK-57. So I think that this is where I half agree with you. I don't agree that it requires psychopaths and sociopaths. I do think that, you know, difficulty does enable growth, but it's the extremes that we could potentially argue about. And I think the extremes are not necessary. In other words, how many people need to die before we need to learn a lesson? You know, over.
But Sam, so yeah, Tyler first.
What I really like about this exercise, Glenn, is that I don't have to rationally ask myself if any of these ideas are realistic or probable on any level. I can just sit here and dream about the what if. And I really like that, because a lot of times I'll get caught up in the, oh, that's impossible, you know. So I want to thank you for bringing that to the table, where you give me an opportunity to ask myself what's working and how can that expand into the future, rather than focusing on what's not working and how it's going to continue not to work or continue to spiral in a downward motion, which is probably the reality. But for this little moment in time, I get to pretend that there is a possibility of sharing, of stewardship, of enlightenment on a lot of different levels. And that's a lot of fun for me. So I really appreciate you putting it in that context, because then I can dream and I can draw it in my mind. And it's those types of unrealistic dreams that when they happen because somebody had it. So this has been really fun for me on that level.
Yes, thank you. And, you know, it is fun for me too. But I mean, the main reason I want to talk about it is because I hear hardly anybody talk about it. And even today, we've spoken a lot about other issues. But if we do focus on these dreams, then it's, you know, that increases the chance of it becoming materialized, especially if we can turn them into actionable specific visions. And that's what I'm looking at. And I would love to hear, Barry, if you have thought more about your continuation, because the question you came to then was these harmonious systems, relatively harmonious, as I heard you. So what would be cybernetic that would work globally?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you finally got around to asking it. Sam talked about putting something into the feedback loop such that if you put the right thing in the feedback loop, you'd get a very stable, well-regulated system. Now, we've been creating feedback loops for 4,000 years. We've been putting something into the loop, intending for it to be the thing that makes it be stable and well-regulated. What was the thing that we keep putting into the feedback loop, whether it's a theocracy, whether it's an aristocracy, whether it's democracy? What are we deciding to insert into the feedback loop? What is the object we're putting into it? And by the way, this thing that we've been putting into the feedback loop for 4,000 years is a colossal mathematical blunder that humans have been repeating for 4,000 or 5,000 years. What have we been inserting in the feedback loop that is the dumbest fucking idea humans ever came up with?
Dualism. Yeah, you talked about that before.
Not dualism.
Well,
Time.
No.
is it the separation between subject and object?
No.
Or you talked about the gradients. You're talking about the gradients, right?
What are we putting into the feedback loop that does not have a gradient at all?
Ones and zeros.
Greed. Because we've got
Good and
this
bad.
notion that more is better. There's a notion with politicians that more is better with
What language,
money and
what
resources.
language do humans
And-
use to communicate?
Good and bad. That's what you're getting at, right, Barry? It's this idea of good and bad.
In music, more is not better. In blues, less is better. So in politics, more is better all the time, and that's a colossal mistake.
Humans have made this mistake since they invented language. What language did we first invent? What language are we using right now? What language are we using?
Wow, English. Human.
English. Okay. So
Spoken.
let's say that what you put in the feedback loop can be expressed in English and must be expressed in English. Then what can you not put in the feedback loop that you really wanted?
Algebra.
You're on the right track, Alex, but go to the next higher level of abstraction above algebra, which is an example of what discipline?
Trigonometry.
Go higher.
So, like multi-dimensional structures, is that sort of the direction?
All right, let me ask you another question. Is it true that we live in a dysfunctional society?
Yeah, definitely.
What is missing in a, listen carefully, what is missing in a dysfunctional society?
Functionality.
Functionality is missing. What language do you speak to learn about functionality? What's the root word of functionality?
Has it got a binary code at its root?
What? Take the word functionality and throw away the prefix and suffix. What's left?
That would be cybernetics, wouldn't it?
Simpler than that.
Ethics.
Take away the suffix of functionality. What's the root word?
Function.
Function. What subject in college do you study to learn about what the hell is a function?
So mathematics.
Mathematics. See, most people think a function is an event where you schmooze with people and have wine and cheese.
Okay.
No, a function is an expression in the language of mathematics that cannot be expressed in the language of words. What belongs in the feedback loop is a mathematical function, and not just any function that you decide you want to vote on. It has to be the function that mathematically solves the system model of the system you want to regulate.
Well, hold on. Feynman was the great explainer, and he attempted this. He and we've talked about that. So, but how much can you get people informed? As Barry said, he made a very good distinction between the people who say we need a solution, between the people who actually know what the solution could be. Those are two different sets of people, and to conflate them is a mistake. So I think that's a big point. I think that, and when the people who don't understand the language of systems are deciding which systems we need to build, there's a lot of feedback loops and Feynman explaining that has to be done to bridge the gap between the people who think in the systems that they know, the math, what they've been taught and contemplated, versus the people who are just trying to make things better for everybody in their community. And how much money is it going to cost? And, and the phone's ringing. So, two different spheres. One's in the political sphere of making things better for their constituents, so to speak, at least in my world. And because I want to bring up China as a total wrench in the conversation, but I don't know if I'm going to get there. But yeah, so I think it's important to keep the dynamics of the system at play. And Barry's making a really good point about understanding what it is that's needed in the conversation feedback loops. And if mathematical talk needs to be discussed, then there's a conference and the people go and discuss it. And then people who trust people that aren't being corrupt say, yeah, I think this guy knows what he's talking about. Let's give the money to that university or that, and I'm not even getting into the possibilities of studies that are going on in DARPA that we would have no idea about. Right. So, there's
I think we might be going in many directions here.
We're going all over the place, but it is coming down to this difference between this interface between the people who know how to solve the problems and the people who decide if the problems need to be solved, and voting or discussing that feedback loop is it's like a three-dimensional chess game, and it's fractal or recursive or however you want. And that's a mathematical idea. Right.
Joshua.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm glad that the dogs are okay. Thank you, Sam, for letting us know. That's a feedback loop here at the GCC where we're concerned about each other and the dogs as well. And also Sam explaining what's going on in his life at the beginning of the conversation. But I think what I'm hearing Barry say and what you brought up, Colin, with Richard Feynman is the idea of the Feynman technique of learning. So changing the dynamics of the system from just learning in one language. And a friend of mine told me speaking one language is like seeing in only one color. So if we're only explaining how to do something in one language, then we're missing the nuances of the explanation itself. And the only language that I'm hearing you say, Barry, that creates a system of functionality is a language that speaks in functionality itself and is created from functionality itself. And that mathematical language is a language that we're all sort of forced and pushed into because we started living our lives in this weird dynamic of bits and bytes and ones and zeros in a digital world where it never was lived that way before. And so we're trying to figure out, why are we pushed into a world where I'm speaking in the English language, but then somebody's system feedback loop will translate that into other languages and miss all the nuances of what I'm saying with my analog communication. And it's missing here on this flat surface screen. I think for years we've been having these Zoom conversations. I took out one factor of the Zoom conversation, which is the video, And there's a whole different dynamic if we all turned off our videos and walked around and lived our daily lives and have a different conversation. It's a completely different way of communicating because we're not sitting, looking, raising hands. And that's what I'm hearing you say, Barry, is that the communication system itself is flawed. Is that what I'm hearing, Barry? I just want to make sure I'm being clear.
I'm going to give you an illustration of a vertical column. This pencil is an example of a vertical column. If I stand it up in my hand and let go of it, what's it going to do? What's it going to do if I let go of it up here?
It's gonna fall.
Yeah, falls over. Vertical columns fall over under the force of gravity, correct? Now,
Can you mute the keyboard, Sam? I can't hear Barry.
Now, I'm going to show you another example of a vertical column. My body is a vertical column, and it's not falling over. How the hell am I not falling over? Please explain to me why this vertical column falls over and this vertical column doesn't. Why is this vertical column stable?
Because it has feedback mechanisms inside that can regulate.
Please recite to me the code that my body is using to not fall over.
Balance.
That's the name of the code. It's the balance function. Can you unpack the balance function? Can you recite the content of the balance function to me?
It's a stability in the posture and the movement pattern relative to your surroundings.
Gravity.
Have you ever seen a Segway? You know the Segway, that thing on two wheels that you can stand on and it will go forward and backward and not fall over?
Yeah.
Have you ever looked at the code that makes it stand upright and not fall over? What language is that code written in?
So it's motion that creates the stability, right?
But it's mathematics.
It's written in a mathematical language. What it's doing is that when the Segway starts to fall forward, there's a sensor that determines how fast and in what direction it's falling. And then it computes a solution to move the base so that the base remains underneath the center of gravity. It's solving the system model. And by the way, if you put this thing on Mars or Moon, you'd have to change the parameters of the function because it depends on the strength of gravity on the surface of the Earth and also on how tall the thing is. So there's a whole lot of mathematics that makes it possible for a one-year-old toddler to do this. It's solving what's called the inverted pendulum problem. Imagine a pendulum, and you want it to stand up and not fall over. So as it starts to fall, you got to move the base so it stays underneath it. That is a classical problem in freshman calculus. Classical problem, the inverted pendulum problem. It takes solving a differential equation in freshman calculus to not fall over. Now, how is it that a one-year-old toddler can solve a problem in freshman calculus, but human society can't figure out how to make a function that's stable for an arbitrary system, except NASA can,
So
Dean Kamen can. People who know how to build cruise controls and autopilots and feedback control systems, they know what function to put in the feedback loop because they put in a mathematical function that solves for the system model. And what do politicians do? They put in words, legislation, rules. How do you make a chaotic system on purpose? Put in the feedback loop a rule, guaranteed to be chaotic. Why? Because as you go from the one side of the rule to the other, the if, then, or else, a tiny perturbation around the judging point, and you get a gigantic change in the behavior. And that's already chaos.
So are you then indicating that in a harmonious social system, what we remove is the rules?
Yes. And put in what instead?
Yes, and that's what I wanted to get to. What
That's
if
a lot
we
of conflation there. That's a lot of conflation. I like the story, but wow, we could at so many ways.
But that is a question we've already looked at a lot. So and I think I understand the basic idea why these kind of rules create an instability.
Right.
So what will we put in instead? that would be more in the theme of today's topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the other mechanism we put in that gives a kind of stability?
So this has been solved by a very few people who have mathematical deep insight, can reason mathematically. And there have been people who have repeated this solution down through the millennia using the available public languages, which is generally a spoken language, because you could give the answer in math, but then you've lost 99.9% of your audience because they don't decode math. If you take a system model of human sociocultural dynamics, you say, let's get a sociological model or a psychological model of how humans behave, a scientific model of how they behave, and we observe that they behave. They go to war and they get arguments and they have all these kind of undesirable behavior patterns. But you can predict these patterns by some kind of a scientific model. Then you solve the scientific model for the ethical best practices to minimize the things you don't want, like conflict and violence and oppression and injustice and corruption and poverty, ignorance, alienation and suffering and terrorism.
What philosophy is that called? Do you have a name for that philosophy?
That's new
Yes.
behavioralism. That's tomorrow's behavioralism.
Utilitarianism?
No, it's the science of great behavior.
I think he's trying to say you take out the ism and put in the mathematics, and then you'll get the system.
Well, the thing about philosophy is it's an upper level tinkling of the language with understanding wrapped around it. So
No, actually,
it's spelled.
I was in a room full of philosophers last night, and we weren't tinkering around with language. We were tinkering around with logic.
Depends, Josh. It always depends on the context. So the context here is about language and how you could insert it into a system. If you had the right language, you could do prediction.
No, that's not what Barry said. He came into
Yeah, that's what he's saying.
He said behavior.
He said you could, yeah, well, whatever he wants to use for his observed inputs, he's going to have a functional thing to say, how am I going to make my next feedback to the system to make it better? So that's what feedback does, or it makes it worse. And it comes
So what is this then? Is it some kind of a science of behavior or some kind of mechanism that enables us
learning.
to see?
It's learning.
Yes,
it's learning. And Barry's making
learning.
a very good point about you got to be careful that when you're learning, you just don't have a step function where one day you're saying yes and then the next minute you're saying no. It's like, wait, how'd you come to that conclusion? Like, I was here yesterday, everything was fine. It's like, nope, sorry, we don't think that's a good way to run society today. Like things like that would have to be very carefully.
Stuff on their minds now, Josh.
You know,
right.
So there's all these constraints that you have to build into a system that does decide. But you know, the question that I'm getting to is the more philosophical one is how do you determine what's really better? And I think you could run all kinds of little systems that solve little problems, but to have one big super system, you know, that's
what if you have
that's different
what
kind
if you
of
have
talking.
an event? You have an event, people measure themselves, how well it was, how happy they were, and you have technology to observe their behavior, what they did. Maybe that could be a part of the science.
Well, there's a lot of science fiction here. Like the movie Her comes to mind, where you had a personal assistant that could look into your emails and
but
schedule
Joshua, you
appointments
had
for
something,
you.
and Alex.
You know, so you know that's kind of a decision-making world where the software knows what you want, but you know, there's so many angles to this. Like, who is we and why do we want it? Who, you know.
I would want an interaction with the software. But anyway,
well, that's what happens. Is it the water company?
But Joshua, go for it.
Well, I was going to say, Alex, go ahead. I think Alex has something more pressing. I'll go after.
I was going to talk about the growth in nature, which is a mathematical function of multiplication, the power of multiplication. So if 80% of the world's population agree on something, like we don't want war, which is probably more like 90% of the world's population, we don't want any more wars where people are killing each other with nuclear weapons. If you ask two people to join that system, you've got exponential growth. And then once they've completed that task of adding two friends, they've received their certificate, their graduate degree. Over.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about systems that swing in a way that isn't beneficial because it swings too far to one side and then too far to the other side, and something that can be a little more stable, as Barry was illustrating in that idea of stability of a function in a system. And what I've come to a conclusion is we spend a lot of time talking about our individual feelings and stories and trying to communicate our individuality. And if we could learn how to tell other people's stories with a feedback loop of asking other people, was this the way you heard it? And maybe try to take the pendulum from swinging so far to the telephone game where it gets abstract and language just complicates it, to getting a feedback system of each person telling each other's stories, to where we start to emerge into a balance of a society that understands what each other is actually feeling, thinking, living. That could create more empathy. And that empathy for each other could allow for a system that could be regulated without words. And I don't know what that would look like, but it would be amazing. And I'm complete.
I love that. Yeah.
Can I tag on to that? Because Joshua, I was just thinking in my mind throughout the evolution of humans, what has worked? When did the system work? And it doesn't mean it was perfect. It doesn't mean it was harmonious, but it seems to me that the hunter-gatherer system was a pretty efficient system. Smaller tribes, hunter-gatherers, for so many different reasons. And what those hunter-gatherers did was they sat around the fire every night and they listened to each other's stories. And they shared their food and they shared their dreams and ideas for the future. So if we were to take it down to a really simple concept of just sitting around the fire, listening to people's stories, it's so simple. And we've gotten so, and I think this Zoom group is like sitting around the campfire for a couple of hours in modern context. So the more that we communicate, the more we tell each other's stories, the more that we have empathy for one another around the globe, our campfire has expanded. I think that's very exciting. And again, that word sharing comes up over and over and over again in things that work. I hear it throughout this entire conversation. If there's one word that shows up, it's sharing. So thank you, Joshua, because I was just visualizing in my mind, right as you were talking about it, that very simple concept. And we can all do that. We can all do that.
So I'm beginning to see a theme here then, that what seems to be the key, it must be something to do with better communication that goes with an education and an increased empathy, understanding, and also a knowledge growth. So could that be the factor in the social global system that creates a stability, that the stability comes from the conversations, from the stories that are shared and received, and then that natural growth of understanding and of, you know, yeah, Tyra, did you have something more to add? Or, well, okay, so anyway, that's sort of yeah, that's what I hear in all this, and also what Sam said.
It's not the me, it's the we. That's the other thing that I'm hearing this. is that the systems that don't work is when it's about the success of one. And the systems that do work is when the tribe's sitting around the fire and they're sharing the food. It's the we.
I'd like to add something too, if I could, Glenn.
Go for it.
Yeah, I like Tyra's interjection on her enjoyment of the conversation in the ability to let herself, imagine into the future without feeling the constraints of trying to get from here to there. And I enjoy that as well, futuristic thinking. And I think there was something started, some conversation about Stacy and Sam and you maybe that wanted to do some storytelling stuff. Do you remember that a couple of weeks ago? I think Sam said he'd be down for that. I can't remember exactly what it was. But the question I have is, Tyra is doing this as a mental exercise and thinking in the future, and I'm good at that, but I'm not good at going there if I'm actually expecting that we're how would you say, suspending the constraints and saying, what ifs, suspend those constraints and just go into that, where I think when I'm talking with you, that's not part of the deal. Like, we're actually talking about what you would consider reality. With Tyra, she's full well engaged in fantasy, thinking ahead. Now, maybe it could be true or maybe it can't, but I enjoy now maybe I'm wrong about that, but those are two different mind spaces and they're both useful for creativity. But one is you're trying to connect back to reality, and the other one, you're going to do that maybe later. I don't know what I'm saying. Does that make sense to you, Tyra?
What was the fantasy part?
Well, just listening to Tyra, her freedom to explore was something I agree with. And you have to suspend reality a bit to get there.
But she spoke about the campfire storytellings, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about 45 minutes ago, I think. I'm still thinking back then, but the campfire was a nice story too. And it is the purpose of, I think, being human is to be human. So I think having great human experiences and community, I think, is extremely rich. And blessed are those that have it. So anyway.
Kayla, yeah, sorry. Kayla, I wanted to say something, but maybe you...
Go ahead, Kayla.
I've been intently listening to you guys, and there's a lot of noise here, so hopefully you guys can hear me. But I started to think along the lines of what you were thinking, Tyra. The systems that worked in the past, when there was very few people, there was a necessity to have this community together. And it was out of necessity that you had to hunt as a tribe, to feed everybody. And I'm pretty sure there was some pride into that. And I started thinking too, among those, I'm almost positive that there were hierarchies there as well. But when you come down to it, I started to think about what was said earlier about individuality. And I think that has a lot to do with it. People just want to feel included. They want to belong. And it's difficult, at least here in the United States, because we value so much independence. And while independence is necessary for growth and change, it's not this all-encompassing thing. I mean, if you think about the history here in California, freeways were made so that we can travel in our own vehicles, and not use the public transportation system, such as in New York. But now we're at a point where there's so many of us that it's almost attractive to be individual, but it's not kind of conducive to the human race. And we really need each other. And this talk about intergenerations hanging out in the same home, I started to think about Polynesians. And the one thing that fascinated me so much was within my own dance group, Graham, who was the founder of the dance group, she openly said, I wanted to raise my grandchildren, you know, knowing that like their parents had to work. That was just that was it. The grandparents, they raised the children, and so the parents can work. And then it kind of goes and goes. Everybody takes care of each other. So how did we lose that? But anyways, that's what I wanted to add. I'm complete.
Tyra. Tyra, you have to unmute. Yeah, happens so easy.
Thank you for that, Kayla. And I'm going through this human experiment in my family right now with my oldest son, who's 23, and his girlfriend. And they have moved in with their father in a large home. And it's really fascinating to watch that we did not raise our boys to move back in with us. It was like, okay, we're raising you, you go out on your own. But with the pandemic and all of that, as a family, we rearranged the way we thought of family. And I'm going to go away from this conversation today and apply it later today when I see my son and his girlfriend, because my son feels like a failure on some level that he's living with his dad again, instead of looking at it like an opportunity. I mean, he sees that opportunity, but he's also kind of embarrassed. You know, he has friends over and he wants to make sure his dad's not around, so his friends think it's his house and not the family house. And I find that really interesting. And so when I meet up with my family later today, which I'm going to share this conversation with them, all of it, you know, the nuggets, and say, look what we have here. We have a very special opportunity to come together and support each other as a family. And so I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And then lastly, when I was in elementary school, our teacher had us studying maps, map making, reading a map. And one day they said, create a map of your island and all the things on the island that you would want. And I remember as a girl that being the most liberating assignment, because I got to create my world instead of studying somebody else's map, instead of, you know, drawing a map of something that already existed. And the fact that I got to use my imagination and I got to dream that perfect island and articulate all the things that were important made it one of my most, I mean, I remember it to this day. I don't remember anything else I learned in that class, but I remember loved making that map. So I just wanted to share that our own map making, if we allow ourselves that creativity, like what we're doing right now, we are creating a map of the future. And I think that that's super cool.
I just want to say goodbye. Thank you guys for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I really appreciate today so much. And Sam for working so hard, and for you, Glenn, hosting the conversation when Sam is on a few hours sleep, and just the way, like what Tyra's just speaking, the way we take care of each other, the way we curate the conversation, whether it be in the English language, mathematical language, and have it, I'm using my finger to say spiral out to the rest of the world. We are the anomaly in the feedback function if we continue to spiral out. But if we hold it to ourselves, then it will just be within our group. But there are thousands and millions of other groups having their own spiraling conversations. And there's people in other parts of the world like David who are just joining us. Good to see you. And I just wanted to, I have a hard stop. Otherwise, I would love to continue this conversation because I got to go somewhere at 11. But if we continue to spiral in a way that doesn't collapse upon itself with that functionality that Barry's talking about, where we're just using words and missing the function, then we're dysfunctional. And that's up to us as humanity to decide that, and up to us as a family of people who gather here on Saturdays. So thank you guys so much. I'm sorry to be so wordy, but I just really appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you. Thank you.
Blessings.
Good to see you, David. We've been doing a little dream weaving and future thinking about social systems and many things today.
I didn't realize it was 11 o'clock my time already. I've got some stuff going on as well, but this was really, really, really fun for me. And thank you, Glenn, for bringing that to the table. And thank you, Sam, for having somebody else facilitate and ask for help. You know, sometimes that's kind of hard. So cheers, everybody. I'll see you when I see you.
Yeah, great to see
Bye.
you. Thank you, Tara. I actually will have to go relatively soon too, but yeah, you want to say a few words, David? We've been going at it for almost 3 hours here, so we've spoken a lot.
Well, I messaged Sam and said, Sam, I'm knackered. I really want to come, but I'm too tight today, so I'm just going to rest. So I've been asleep. I've woke back up. Sam said we're still going, so I said, oh, well, I'll drop on for 5 minutes and just say hello to everybody and catch up. So it looks like it's been an exceptionally good session. It's a shame I missed it, but I feel much brighter now. And I look forward to seeing it on YouTube very soon and just seeing what's happened. And Glenn, I'm glad you're chairing this, CoVisioning. I think it's a great idea. And it's a great way to start thinking about moving forward, at least anyway. And then the process begins, and it'll all come together to a stage of movement for us all, I guess. It's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned, yeah, we touched upon many topics. I mean, the idea was a little bit to dream into future global systems, and Harry spoke a lot about cybernetics and certain stable systems. If a system is completely stable, completely repetitive, it's what you would call a clock. But if I heard Barry correctly, the solar system's not a clock. I'm not sure. Well, we didn't talk about whether there are clocks in nature, like absolutely repetitive systems, but certainly, you know, our global social systems, nothing like that. So there's some kind of an equilibrium. And Barry made the point that if you put rules into complex systems, it actually creates chaos, because it doesn't have a gradient. So that's a whole big topic. I think it's related to what's sometimes called dualistic thinking, either or thinking. That's a whole big topic, but we were trying to lean a little towards what would be a harmonious system, or what would be an ability of a system to regenerate itself. And that brought us to this idea of collective learning, collective sense making, knowledge sharing, which we also spoke about. And it's sort of, yeah, one possibility is that could be a factor for some stability. Yeah. Alex.
One of the issues that I see in science and geometry is the fact that time is seen as being something separate and different from space. In actual fact, they're both the same thing. Looking at them from different scales. You know, billions of years ago, light's arriving here, and we can see these galaxies in the distance, in the deep field image from Hubble. And they don't exist. They're probably gone by now. But the thing is, we can still see them because the light's moving through space over a period of time. Over.
Motion in space. Sam, you've been quiet, but going on for a while.
I just wanted to share that ugly link that I put in the chat. that to me signifies why I think democracy is doomed. It's a GIF. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's a woman opening her car door, and then she can't get into the front seat. So she walks all the way around the car to get into the front seat because she can't get into the front seat once she's opened the car door. These people are allowed to raise children, to drive on the streets, to vote and decide what we do with our tax dollars. This is why I've always said democracy is nowhere near a good, not to mention the best, way to collaborate or make group decisions. And that, I mean, I don't even care if it's a doctored video. There's similar equivalent acts being done millions of times per day. I mean, the Darwin Awards are a testament to that. So I think the co-creation of better decisions, actions, systems, regulations, agreements, laws, charters, the co-creation, the constant reevaluation based on feedback, the constant dynamic interchange of values and resources and empathy and compassion and communication and care and connection, that's what will stabilize us. But to have people who are given driver's licenses who can't figure out how to get into the driver's seat, letting them decide the future, I might as well blow my brains out right now. That's not a future I want to live in. Over.
That's a little similar to what Schmachtenberger talked about, right? That if you're going to have something like a democracy that works, there has to be a comprehensive education of the masses. And with education, I think he's
Right.
thinking in the direction of what you real education, right?
Well, you know, that will improve things from the way they are today, but they're still not going to produce the optimal systems. Now, optimal is a dangerous word. It's a multifaceted word, but I do think it needs to be inserted into the conversation because you can get everybody to be a little bit better educated, hopefully, you know, raise the water level a little bit, you know, but you still have the spectrum. The spectrum is still in effect. So what I prefer is to get the best ideas out there, the most fruitful ideas, not just every idea, you know?
The best, yeah.
Yeah, let's look at the best. After all, that's what nature has done. Nature has weeded out and made the best, quote unquote, survivable, adaptable.
But what if we take it even further? Like, if we forget the word education, what if we imagine something that has education, but it's way further? It's also embodied knowledge. It's the process for studying those best ideas, and even a framework that can help us know what situations certain knowledge is relevant, in terms of a situational knowledge map. That's a little bit similar to the how-to idea we've been talking about. But it's like, if we could imagine something like that, first of all, democracy would work better, but it would be much more because we would have an engine which could perhaps put us in a position where we would completely transcend the need for democracy or the need for any laws at all, perhaps. And that's an opportunity. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, David. Did you put up your hand now, or maybe Alex wants to go?
I'm talking about the weighted system that Sam promotes, where the majority might vote for something, and then, okay, we'll put that on the table and allow the smart people to go over it and decide whether or not it's adopted.
They should know what they're voting for, shouldn't they? I mean, isn't that kind of the point here?
Well, they obviously, the popular vote, people want faster cars and cheaper hamburgers and shorter hours at work. All these things that are not necessarily good for the economy or the safety of the community. But if we have a look at those proposals that they're voting for and say, is this a smart idea, or is this going to damage the future of the outcomes? Is it going to make things worse in the future for the environment and for the economy? If it is, it's out. If it's not, it's in. It's like as simple as that. It doesn't need to be complicated. Over.
But it requires some conscious, intelligent deliberation
You've got to
by
take
somebody.
Money has to be removed from politics.
I think it seems that the political aspect is completely corrupted. Once a file's that corrupted, once a hard drive that is that broken and is actually dysfunctional that much, has to be removed. Now there has to be something to bolster that behind, and independent communities that are completely empowered are that principle. Now, if they're scattered across the entire globe, basically, I think what you were saying, Glenn, about the clock or the watch. If you imagine that the solar system is a clock, the really cool stuff's happening on the macro level. Look at the Earth at this moment in time. So there are time scales. There's no such thing as time, but there are dimensions of movement of flow that are different for each constituent. So for a human, it's a tiny, minuscule time scale where we run around like ants doing as much as we possibly can. And on the whole, that microcosm of empowerment, this tiny little mote of dust, changes the entire frequency of the omniverse, the universe, of all of it. So there are functional aspects that are vast. And as we fasten into them in this catalytic growth scale of harmony, it influences everything else from the macro to the micro to the macro level. So we have to look at the macro and the micro, and basically the macro level isn't working anymore. The one size glove that fits all doesn't fit all. It never has. And when you're telling somebody to wear gloves, it's not even cold outside. You know, you cannot have a centralized governance system that is either America or England, Great Britain, a queen or a king that dominates the rest of the world, destroys living systems, destroys indigenous systems, indigenous peoples, and then starts to try and destroy its own communities with the same programming, calling it a schooling system. It has to be completely functional in the space that it exists, i.e. the community and the living aspects in which it exists. We have to break the barriers down. We have to see the planet as one country. Nationalism stops. And then if we have we are the world, the earth, and Saturn's are bad, we have to have that sort of same opinion of the rest of the universe, because when other species start to come forward, when we've evolved enough for them not to be too scared to come near us, and multi-dimensional species, and you know, not only, you know, fairies, unicorns, maybe they do exist. Maybe we just can't see them, and maybe they don't want to be seen because we're absolutely fucking stark, staring bonkers. I wouldn't want to visit humans. I don't want to be here half the time. So we have to get to a stage where we can first relate to our environment, renaturalize, because we've been denaturalized by these same people that have tried to destroy all of the natural systems on the planet, masculinated. We've ran our lives paternally as patents.
So
and
again, it's,
a rainforest or a war killing millions of people to save $10 so the books balance. That's basically what's happening now. It's like, oh, COVID, we'll shut everything down. We'll use this. It might be a real pandemic. It might have been created in a lab by Pierre and Bill Gates. It might not. But what we'll do is we'll use this to shut down all the small businesses so all the conglomerate businesses can now take control across the globe. It's exactly the same principle. Now, there's a schismatic aspect to that, which centralized government allows everywhere. And this power over power under domination, top-down bullshit. Now, if there's a bottom-up movement and a top-down movement, we've got two pyramids, and basically, you know, we're reaching up to God, and God's reaching down to the earth. It roots in. Everything works. So we just have to start the second movement. It is a symphony after all. Yeah?
And that's it. That movement is to create the regenerative communities, which are already starting, and must also include an ability to learn and evolve our understanding, right? That's what all of this is pointing towards.
We are the bottom, moving upward.
Yes. And that means that, yeah, it can move upward, all kinds of solutions. I said, Alex, you were going to bed? Do you have any last words? It's late over there.
Yeah, there's one thing that I'd like to point out is that before we allow somebody to register for voting, we should make them undergo an aptitude test. Over.
I would like to transcend the need for voting in the traditional sense. You know, I just say, well, what am I feeling about all this is that before, it's so easy to get stuck in the weeds of problems that we're trying to find solution to certain problems, when maybe the best solution is a much simpler solution where we can just avoid having to deal with those problems because they're just, they take care of themselves. So, you know, I'm kind of tempted towards looking for simpler solutions globally than you know, many of the ones that's usually spoken about. So that's again why I want to sort of bring up this theme of humans in specific places with specific things, and whether it's possible to solve a lot of these issues on the situational level, so that the higher level concepts, which have often become higher level confusions and endless rabbit holes and distractions, we can sort of put them aside because we don't really need them. We don't really need money to solve the core challenges, because the core challenges seems to be much more to do with the state of human beings, psychologically, physically, where they're placed in regards to physical things. And then all of those concepts have sort of been built around the dynamic that's in the past. And so if the dynamic changes, clearly the meaning of those concepts will change as well. So at least this is my intuition, that we can't solve any of this by sort of conceptualization in that sense. But there seems to be possibilities if we could think much more simple in terms of embodied physical presence in the, let's call it the time-space continuum. Yeah. What do you think, something, David? I think, Sam, I'd love to hear what you think about that too, because you've been working actually with some situational code.
Actually, I just wanted to let you know that Alex has had his hand up for quite a while before I go.
Alex just spoke and he's going to bed, he said. I think yeah.
I had a point I wanted to make, but before I do that, what was the question you wanted me to respond to again?
Well, you have previously been working with sort of situational data, and you also have this idea of a global sim, because I'm trying to look for something simpler here, because it's so easy to overcomplicate this. But if we just look at the problem, the global problem, in terms of the physical positionings of human bodies in space, and the movement of things from one location to another, and the logistics of, events. Could we sort of find something in the pure event space that can create a harmony, a harmonious movement pattern, you could say, of behavior and distributional resources and logistics? Maybe this sounds weird, but I'm just sort of wondering if we could put this right back to the issue of physical patterns of movement in space and solve it there and solve all the other problems from here. That's the thing I'm
Well, I will
wondering
respond,
about.
but I'm not going to respond to the physical movement in space question, because that is only an approximation, really, of the bigger problem that we're trying to talk about. And my response is still that if you let every person decide what good is, and let that person be as fully informed as possible, whatever the person needs, whether it's education, information, data streams, guidance, mentorship, coursework, etc., let that person be enriched as much as that person wants to be. Let that person evolve a personal notion of what good is and how that person might bring about that good in that person's life. And then let that person get the feedback on whether the intended effects are actually happening, or whether there are quote unquote unintended consequences that mean you have to go back and, hey, say, did I really do good? Or is my notion of good a little bit off? And how may I course correct? And do this frequently. And do this with people who can give you honest feedback. This to me, and I've been saying it, for 8 years now, to me is how you get individuals to take that responsibility, exercise that freedom, and really do what they think is best. Because what they think is best is what they're going to commit to. But if I tell you what to do, you're going to say, nah, I ain't going to do it. So that's my response to you, is to see emergent patterns behave when we start doing this.
So you're describing a learning environment, right? A learning communities.
However, a component of this, a big if, is we need to give people the education, the coursework, all the data, et cetera, right? So some of us need to be putting that together. Any one of us can be putting that together. And that should also be co-created. And that's why this COI with Global SIM on top is really what I'm trying to sort of lean into, okay? My other smaller point I'd like to make before I release the floor and check out is a minor poke I just sent to Barry a few minutes ago, which is Barry was saying stories are functional. And I'm only poking at Barry a little bit because I know he understands the notion of functional in programming and in mathematics. Function would not be a word that I would use in that context, because a function says, given the identical inputs, you will get the same identical output. Otherwise, you don't actually have a function, okay? I don't think stories are intended to have that effect. Stories are appreciated because they have different ways that they land on everybody, okay? And that's why I would actually, myself personally, not use the word functional when describing storytelling. And that's just a little nit slash poke that I was just sending Barry's way.
Yeah, actually, if you look at the etymology of function, it's related to the etymology of purpose. Function and purpose really come from the same fundamental root in languages. So when I say function, I really meant purpose.
Purpose can be, used, and we can discuss that as well. But the word function in my context minorly triggered me.
Yeah. Sounds a little engineering.
This is the problem with word-based languages, is the words don't have precise definitions as they do in mathematics.
Hence disambiguation. And hence, when we're actually conversing, if we just throw in random new words by the hundreds and thousands, to me, that's why I don't really know where to start.
But now, Sam, I hope you see that this is the reason why I was talking about this with patterns of movement in space. because this is the reason why I mentioned this. If we can look at this in a more sort of physical, spatial way, because all the words are understood very differently, and there's continuous misunderstanding when we use these high-level concepts.
Yes.
That's one of our real challenges. David, what would you?
Barry mentioned guidelines and being railroaded. Now, basically, our language is being railroaded. We have dictionaries, we have the English dictionary, we have schooling systems, and basically, if you begin to then use different terms and words, or change the word to mean something slightly more fluid, you're railroaded back. It's the system's a self-policing system. It's become so top-heavy and complex that pretty much everything and everyone is afraid to move out of the box because everybody else will police them. It's like Nazi Germany. England, for me, in that sense, was absolutely intolerable. Now, our slang words, we would come up with new words, and somehow they would be overborne and destroyed. But they would be more descriptive than the words that were actually there. And maybe language does need to evolve. Maybe from space to space, we need to pick the most descriptive words, like kaput, meaning broken, in Thailand and England and many of the countries across the world. Ongelooflijk is a much better word for unbelievable than unbelievable, because unbelievable doesn't sound that unbelievable, but the Dutch word does. So imagine that we had a dictionary that actually evolved to bring the most descriptive words and allow that flow in every aspect of life. Look at a city, it's static. It's built to be static. It's built to be there or at least 200 years ago, it was built to be there forever. Now it's built to be there for 10 minutes so that it can fall apart and make more profit from it afterwards. Now, if we change that so that flowfulness and that evolutionary state is positive rather than negative, rather than built on deficit and the monetary system, it's there to create biodiversity, happiness, and cohesion, it makes for a better world. So we've set an intention for a better world. We've set an intention for abundance, rivalry rather than rivalry.
So
and
you're
all of this
pointing
was started
towards sort of, you're kind of pointing towards artificial scarcity there, right?
It's been programmed in on purpose.
Yeah, that's a part of our cultural programming. We're always thinking scarce.
That's it.
Ways.
Always hungry. You see a consumer, you can turn in any direction there's food, or it looks like there's food, and you can turn a consumer against another consumer. But someone that's happy and balanced and fluid and flexible and knows their worth and knows their space, their place in a fluid world that's constantly changing, and they can change and adapt to it, cannot be controlled.
No.
So the bottom-up movement and this that we're talking about right now, this is groundbreaking. This is history being made. It's not history being made.
But then it must be an intelligent, a peaceful, a well-functioning bottom-up movement and emerges that can generate real intelligence on a far higher level than the top-down rule-based systems, right? That seems
it already is. Look at us.
Yes, and it already is, of course, to a large degree, but still, I think they need to evolve a lot further still, and they can, and it's really great work that we're involved in here in that sense. Yeah, did you have something more? Sorry that I interjected there. But...
I look forward to the next levels of movement. Although it's always now. I'm like a child at Christmas. I'm like, I want to open the presents now, and it's not even, a month before Christmas.
Okay,
but I think
yes.
But I think basically holding space and allowing us to go through our processes, our triggers, and openly letting us flip out when we need to, arguing a little bit, realizing we need space to maybe adapt and drop off to a separate room. All of these things is our consciousness finding its flow and harmony to a point where we're not tuning up, we're not playing jazz anymore, although jazz is great as well. We're actually coming to a point where the harmony, the symphony, is not a frequency anymore. It's a constancy. The practice, spiritual practice, to this practice, to that practice is over. We're actually doing it real time. We're in the moment, we're in the present moment. Forgiven. Present.
Creating more harmony.
Yes. So I said when I first came to GCC, we're all very much like hedgehogs, backing into the room with the spines out. We've turned round and we're actually facing each other with the soft underbelly, and we're starting to shed the spines. That's what I feel. Colin asked where out of 10 where I thought, or out of 11, where I thought we were as a group. And I said probably about a 5 or a 6 if we go further into deepening into the trauma release, because we all have it. Everything that triggers us is a trauma. Everything that we cannot accept, or everything that we, who doesn't overeat, who doesn't eat the wrong foods, who doesn't use toxic things in their home, who we all have a level of trauma. It could be minute or it could be vast.
Definitely.
But as a group, when we decide to work on it, it all comes out at once. So somebody's trauma that is minute in the scope of things for most other people will be released at, someone's father dying in a car crash, or just the same. And the group grows and expands, and everything grows. Our ability to cope. It's all about holding space, whatever that means, and giving us safe space for us to come to play. Yeah. Sam uploaded a link for Steve Jobs, and when he was stressed or strained in the Apple business, he would go and play and talk about what they could achieve and how vast it could be, and what his Freelicium or New Earth or Paradise Earth looked like. Now, this is part of it. We have to. This vision and together is super important. I'm glad you did this today, Glenn. It's an amazingly
I feel that it's a missing piece in our culture today. It's a very strange thing that there's so little discussion about what future we actually want. It's very strange. Talking endlessly about the futures we don't want, but it seems very important to actually have a real conversation about what that could be.
If the law of attraction has any validation, it says you attract the energy that you project in voice, in thought. So that central core of inner work is super important. We have to get to a stage where we speak positive, we speak honestly, we are completely and utterly authentic, and we have to do that by releasing trauma, by trusting each other, etc., and moving forward, leaning into this fully. And it gets to a stage where we have to fully commit. We have to fully commit.
Now I feel you're at the center of the issue here, of what practically needs to happen, because everything else we've spoken about today seems to all depend on this. It's this fundamental personal release of trauma. Yes, it's a trust that there's a space that opens for also then a more positive way of being and positive way of thinking and sharing, and from that also then culture changes. That's what I hear you describe.
If I know what everybody's trauma is and what their dreams are, I know that the only way I can be happy is if you guys are happy. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can to fulfill your dreams without putting mine on hold. And I know that mine will be honored as well. So we don't move forward. We've asked them.
Exactly.
We grow inner, and it's infinite. It can go on forever, and we grow on the outer scale infinitely as well. And that's the beauty of it. You know, once we hit rapture, it goes on forever and just keeps getting better, and our ability to process rapture becomes better.
That's the hope I have too, that we can get to that point. But anyway, I really will soon have to go, but I would love to hear Sam and Barry's last words here, because I'm sure you have made many thoughts today.
I thought I was going to have a last word the previous time, but let me just conclude with a couple other things I've heard here, which is normally when I ask someone else to moderate, and thanks for doing so, Glenn, I try to reserve the last 15 minutes for kind of a debrief, right? A retrospective on, did we move where we wanted to move? Did we increase any sense of collaboration, co-visioning, co-creation, sense making, all those sort of questions? And if we have a session focused on co-visioning, I'm actually curious, because I observed at points in this session, it was difficult to focus on the visioning. There were, difficulties, objections, contradictions, the difficulty of how-tos, even though you were very clear you wanted to do the co-visioning piece. I'm just reflecting, and I think I'm probably guilty of it myself, that it's difficult to maintain that focus without saying, oh, but this is not going to happen because, or that's the, so we get embroiled. Once we put something up there, we get embroiled in, oh, but I can't take this path and I can't take that path, and this is in the way, and people are not going to do that. And I was guilty of that, like I said, myself. So that's why I think these pillars deserve their own devoted time, so that we can actually talk about, or at least start those conversations on those topics. I imagine that if I did one on sense making, it would wander into co-creation, it would wander into co-visioning, it would wander into all those other, topics. And if we did one on co-creation, it would do the same. Okay, so anyway, I'm just reflecting on how difficult it is for us to maintain focus. And so I'm just curious that we as a group are still trying to learn how to do that together.
But that goes right back to this point that we don't learn to co-vision in our culture, because our culture does not speak about the future we want. It's a missing piece.
5 years old or 6.
What?
Except
yeah, exactly. Up until we're 5, it's weird. It's like a big missing piece of our global culture, is this skill at co-visioning and thinking about the possible. Instead, we have this tendency to get into all these mind games. Oh, what if this happens? What if that happens?
By the way, that's another smart people problem. I think I'll just crystallize, Smart people are quick to tell you why something can't be done.
I don't think it's so smart anymore. I think we're in a different situation.
The word smart is inserted there also with some humor.
It is a brilliant word, because everyone thinks they're so smart.
Exactly.
My own thoughts make perfect sense to me. They seem so logical. I think it's like that for many people. Barry, did you have any? You've been listening for a while, but do you have anything more you wanted to add?
I just want to point out that, well, almost all of us speak at least some level of English with some partial overlap of the meaning of words and the use of grammar. Almost nobody in modern times is fluent in mathematics. And so ideas that need to be expressed in mathematics are virtually impossible to communicate if you're required to communicate them in ordinary, everyday English. And you use metaphors, poets use metaphors to try to get around the problem, but metaphors are so bloody vague, and other people will take them perfectly literally instead of metaphorically. And I don't think we're going to solve our problems of dysfunctionality until we have a population which is fluent and literate in mathematics, so we can communicate mathematical ideas and not get lost in the bloody woods.
Or at least appreciates it.
Yeah, it's like art appreciation. I'm not an artist. I don't compose music. I don't paint pictures, like Tyra can. I don't dance, like Kayla can, but I can appreciate the arts. I think we need people who can appreciate science and mathematics And technology, even though they can't create it, they can at least have an appreciation for it and realize when you have to defer to the subject matter experts who are fluent in those languages,
Right.
even if you don't understand it. You have to have faith in them. It's like you have to have faith in NASA that they can get a bloody rocket to Mars and land it, without having the whole thing go haywire. And they won't do it perfectly every time. They're going to make mistakes too, but nobody else could possibly do it.
So here again, we're going back to this issue of sense making of science, which in the present system is held back by the fact that there's all these different languages, the
Right.
scientific disciplines. It's not easy to transmit
Right.
knowledge. And then there's also copyright,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
another
one
issue.
of the big elephants in the room when we talk about science. So that, what we currently call science as a system, I mean, it certainly is nowhere close to any pure manifestation of the scientific method. It's a mixture of a little of that, but it's so the issue in terms of co-visioning would be, what would the science of the future be? And that's not really a question we went into in any depth today, but I think that would be an incredibly interesting topic to
The
discuss.
whole observation that a toddler can stand up without falling over, but almost no adult can explain the code that's running to allow you to do that. That's pretty astonishing that you can repose the method of solving a problem in freshman calculus since you were 1 year old, but almost no adult can articulate what the code is doing other than simply giving it a name like I'm balancing. It doesn't really tell you anything. It's like saying gravity, something's falling. It doesn't tell you how it works.
Anyway, guys, I really loved it today. I have to go now, but yeah, this was really rich. So have
Thanks, Glenn.
material for lots of visions.
I look forward to continued interaction on these topics, post-session.
Yeah, let's continue the co-visioning.
Yep. Anybody with any more thoughts? Going once, going twice. Soul to
Last
the gentleman
thought.
in Nor's way.
I've got one last thought. Imagine that our classrooms didn't have someone at the front and our governance didn't have someone at the front. We all sat in circle and worked it out together with fun and enjoyment and fluidity. And our scientific method was pretty much like the old shamans. Try it, see how it works out, and then share that knowledge so nobody else has to die.
And if you're still
That's
alive,
my-
come back and tell us that you survived.
With food, with music.
Yes,
Well,
And
and
stories.
coffee.
Adventure
Good
stories.
night, everybody.
Stories.
Take care.
Bye-bye for now.
Thanks, Sam.